Something was wrong in Hans Peter's life. It was a gut feeling, but he couldn't figure out exactly what it was. It seemed as if a cold fog had descended between him and Marjorie, his wife, and he could not clear it away to find her again. This morning he bought miniature roses for her, and she accepted them without even thanking him. When he returned home, he found withered roses on the kitchen table. Sighing, he threw them into the trash. "Why am I still trying?" he thought sadly. He returned to the living room. Marjorie was already asleep, and he needed some time to rest after another stressful shift. His company was still refusing to invest in replacing old, worn-out, and often faulty production robots, causing disruptions on production lines. As a shift supervisor, he and his maintenance team had to keep these disruptions to a minimum, which was hard, intensive work. Also very stressful. Sitting alone in the silence of the night, he wondered what had gone wrong. No matter what he did, he and Marjorie grew apart emotionally, and as usual, he blamed himself for it. Their intimacy has already faded away. Even small affections and hugs have been absent for at least a year. Now she pulled back, and mentally. Hans was quite a fit man for his 60 years and his lifestyle. The lifestyle meant working irregular shifts from the age of 20, including night shifts and weekend work. Marjorie worked part-time for the Department of Education, supporting school inspectors in ensuring the quality of teaching in schools. He carried a few extra pounds, and it showed a little around his stomach. But because he was always physically active, his lifestyle did not present him with cardiovascular problems or diabetes, although he had problems sleeping. Especially during night shifts, his sleep was reduced to 3 hours. After 7 night shifts, it took him almost a week to return his sleep-wake rhythm to normal. Understanding the dangers, he exercised almost daily. He could still run a half marathon in just over 2 hours and, as much as possible with his shifts, took Tai Chi classes and also didn't think twice about a good 25-mile walk. He would have liked to have a regular office job, but the extra pay for working shifts and bonuses for keeping lines running above agreed levels amounted to almost a third of his income. This, in turn, meant that his 2 children earned master's degrees without having to take out student loans. For Hans, it was all worth it. They raised 2 responsible and balanced children, son Stefan and daughter Louise, who gave them 2 grandchildren. His eldest grandson, Kevin, was from Stefan, and his granddaughter, Rita, Louise's daughter, was born just 2 days after Kevin. And between them, there was that special connection that arises when children grow up next to each other from birth. When they met after being apart for a week or more, the rest of the world ceased to exist for them until they reconnected. The 2 other grandchildren differed in age by about 6 months. Hans and Marjorie still lived in the house they had bought when Stefan was 1 year old. It was a small country house with a city garden. The house was located just outside the city limits, a short walk from the park and nature reserve on the other side of the border. The proximity to all city amenities, shops, public transport, medical center, and theaters combined with a unique location meant that Marjorie and Hans never had any desire to move. Hans was a quiet man who avoided conflict and was considered a weakling by some of his brothers-in-law. However, his sister-in-law knew him better and was very attached to him in a sisterly way. Hans' parents had a bad marriage. They argued often and loudly about everything, and it was the mother who abused the father, both verbally and physically, and not the other way around. That's why he hated arguing and why Marjorie almost always got her way. He had his own strict boundaries and prohibitions, and he was ready to defend them. No cheating, no bullying or humiliating other people. Keep your promises, be responsible for your actions, and be loyal to your loved ones. Even before the wedding, Marjorie realized that Hans did have limits, and that it was better not to cross these boundaries. Then they were very close to not getting married at all almost 40 years ago. They weren't even engaged, but had been in an exclusive relationship for some time, and were discussing the possibility of spending the rest of their lives together when Marjorie and Hans met again before a party at Marjorie's friends. Marjorie spent a month's holiday with her parents, and Hans, then only 18, worked a summer job. 2 days after the party, They were to go on a 10-day camping trip. For this holiday, Hans was able to rent his mother's car. He himself rode a restored 1967 BMW R69's motorcycle. After restoring the motorcycle to its original form, he also found a Hosk fuel tank capable of holding 10 gallons of gasoline, allowing the motorcycle to travel long distances without having to refuel, and he wanted to use it for his vacation with Marjorie. Marjorie's mother strongly objected to them going on a motorcycle trip and forbade Marjorie to do so. Luckily, Hans' mother came to the rescue by lending them her car. That night of the party, Hans parked his motorcycle in front of Marjorie's house and picked her up. An hour later, they arrived at the party, and Hans expected that after completing the required formalities, they would become close again after a month's separation. Marjorie did all of this except getting close to Hans again. She completely ignored him. She started talking and then dancing with the other guy all evening, giving Hans a cold shoulder every time he approached her. Hans felt abandoned and began to get irritated. He was about to approach the couple when a mutual friend appeared. They talked for a while, and at that moment they both saw the man kiss Marjorie. But instead of Marjorie pulling away, the kiss became heated and turned into a serious lip lock. Hans turned to his friend. "I wonder what happened during her vacation. Looks like she doesn't need me anymore. If necessary, she can leave with my replacement and you can take her home. My vacation will start a few days early." Eric replied, putting his arm around Hans's shoulders. "I'm really sorry this happened. Yes, I'll look after her. Stupid." At the end of the evening, Marjorie was standing alone looking for Hans, holding the helmet in her hands when she saw Eric. "Where is Hans?" "He left early, saying he wanted to go on vacation a few days early. He was pretty angry when he left." "Why, just because I was talking to another guy. He needs to grow up a little." "Maybe, but ignoring my boyfriend after a month apart would also make me mad. But kissing that bastard was the straw that overflowed the cup." Marjorie blushed. "Damn it, I didn't realize. It was a game and I lost. Did he really see it? We both saw you wrap your lips around his. I think you can consider yourself free again. Hans had the decency to ask me to take you home if necessary. I promised to do this. If I were Hans, I would leave you here." Eric turned and headed towards the exit. "Are you coming?" he asked. Late morning. Marjorie finally got up the courage to go to Hans's house. She was as scared as a cat in a dog kennel and waited for the door to open after she rang the bell. "What are you doing here?" followed a sharp question from Hans's younger sister. A voice was heard from the room. "Who's there, Annika?" Without turning around, Annika replied, "It's that same bitch." She didn't have time to finish because she heard, "Annika, watch your language and invite her inside." Annika abruptly closed her mouth and, frowning, walked away to the side without saying anything. Inside, Marjorie timidly asked, "Is Hans home? I think I owe him an apology." "He's gone, honey. He returned quite early last night, telling us that you had replaced him with a new friend and that he had decided to go to France alone." "When is he leaving? I noticed your car is still outside." "He took the BMW. Yesterday, after he told us, he changed the fuel tank to a Hosk tank and installed racks. He packed up and left this morning around 5. Marjorie hung her head in disappointment. "What happened, honey? He was very angry with you." "I know, and it's my fault. I took Hans for granted. I ignored him all evening, reconnecting with friends instead of Hans, and something happened. Halfway through the evening, I got involved in a stupid game of truth or dare and lost. The guy I lost to demanded that I kiss him. When I did this, everything got out of control. Hans must have seen this, because after that I couldn't find him. That's why I came here. I wanted to explain myself and apologize." "Well, you'll have to wait for him to come back. He promised not to stay longer than 14 days. I can only hope he calms down a little." "And that another girl didn't take him away," Annika said angrily, which made Marjorie turn pale. "Annika, didn't I tell you to bite your tongue?" Annika's mother's voice sounded like the blow of a whip. Annika silently ran inside. Marjorie left, feeling empty and stupid. 3 weeks have passed. She didn't hear a word from Hans. Her parents received a card. Her older sister Dorina, or as Hans always called her, Dory, even a letter. She wasn't particularly surprised by this. Hans always called Dorina his older sister and joked that if she didn't have a boyfriend, he would ask her to marry him. But she received nothing at all. No letters, no cards, no call. Last year, he even called her twice from a phone booth, and she remembered how happy she was. Marjorie knew that Hans was back and felt the pain of his absence every time she heard the hoarse roar of his motorcycle engine when she was at college. Hans attended the same college, but studied engineering with a minor in design. She studied textile design and pedagogy. For a whole month, she tried to catch him in college. Between school, his job at a car repair shop, Tai Chi and running, he was rarely home. The car service was in an area where it was better not to go. To get into the dojo, you had to be a member of the club, and Hans hated training at the school stadium and ran mostly in the park or forest. He was too fast to catch up anyway, let alone have a normal conversation while running. To add to her problems, the guy she kissed at the party named Frank was convinced that she was now his girlfriend and did not take rejection seriously. He continued to pursue her and became increasingly irritated by her refusal to succumb to his charms. Hans never parked his motorcycle in front of the college. He witnessed what can happen when a car turns into a supposedly empty space. One day, the beautiful Norton Commando was almost completely destroyed. Hans parked his motorcycle behind the building, along with other motorcycle owners. The college didn't mind and even provided a locker room for their motorcycle suits and a key to the back entrance for easy access. Of course, this was only allowed to those who could prove they rode a motorcycle to college. Hans was heading towards the locker room through the tangled corridors and along the storage rooms that made up the basement when he heard a familiar voice shouting, "No, damn it! I told you I'm not interested. You're disgusting." The voice rose with a hint of panic. "Get your hands off me." A deeper voice responded, "Come on, you want it. Just admit it and give in." And then Hans turned the corner and saw Frank pinning Marjorie against the wall, pawing at her breasts. "I clearly heard her say she wasn't interested. So why don't you leave her alone and go away?" Hans growled. He might still be angry with Marjorie, but he couldn't allow her to be treated like that. Frank was surprised for a moment, but came to his senses almost immediately. "What the hell? Mind your own business. Now she's mine. She is not yours and not mine. And if you don't understand what it means, I may have to teach you." "What?" Frank shouted, angry because he was interrupted when he finally cornered this bitch. Out of nowhere, he pulled out a small club, raised it threateningly, and approached Hans. "When I'm done with you, I'll make her scream with pleasure, and she'll never want another man again." "Man," Hans encouraged, thinking, "keep him angry. Evil opponents make mistakes easily. Are you a man because you hold your little wand in your hand? Oh, please." Frank exploded, swung his baton at Hans' head, but only hit the air. Hans anticipated the movement. He dodged the blow and simply stepped into range. He delivered a powerful two-handed blow to the chest and solar plexus, just as his sensei had taught him. Frank fell to his knees, feeling as if he had been hit by a train. Suddenly, all the air was rushed out of his body, and he couldn't breathe. Hans helped him lie down gently on the ground. When Frank was on the floor, Hans whispered in his ear, "It was just a light blow to warn you. If I ever suspect that you are bothering women, I will come for you, and you will need a stretcher. Got it, bastard?" Frightened, Frank blinked and nodded. Hans rose to his feet again and told Marjorie, "He'll be all right in a minute. Let's go." Marjorie knew that Hans took Tai Chi lessons, and she once saw a documentary about China where people practiced Tai Chi, but the movements were slow and exaggerated, and it didn't make her realize that it was a martial art. She shuddered and asked in a quiet voice, "Can you take me home, please?" "I can't. I'm on a motorcycle and you don't have a helmet. I still have your helmet. It's in my locker. I. She started crying. Oh, okay. Go get a helmet. I'll take the motorcycle to the front of the building. Thank you. I love you. She quickly kissed him on the cheek and ran in the other direction. Hans, frozen, pondering what had just happened, shrugged his shoulders and went to get the motorcycle. Marjorie got off her motorcycle and was wondering if she should invite Hans in when Dorina opened the door. I thought I heard your motorcycle, Hans. Come in. I have coffee and I need to talk to you. Inside, Marjorie went upstairs to freshen up. Meanwhile, Dorina, after a short conversation, carefully watching Hans, concluded, You're not going to take her back, are you? No, no way. I can't live with the idea that when I'm not around, she seeks comfort from another man. We promised each other fidelity, and she broke that promise right before my eyes. It makes me think about what happened when she was on vacation with you and your parents. Dorina did not answer. She had a heated argument with her little sister when she caught her in a passionate petting scene with a local guy. Marjorie's sarcastic response was, If you don't tell Hans, he'll never know. What's wrong with that? Hans noticed that Dorina did not contradict him and did not deny that something had happened. He took a deep breath and said, The fact that you don't confirm that nothing happened is something that I won't accept is enough. You found yourself between a rock and a hard place. You don't want to give your sister away, and you don't want to lie to me. Dorina bit her lip and looked intently at her cup of coffee. Hans stood up and said, You can tell Marjorie that I understood everything myself. I don't blame you. It's all on your sister. With these words, he went out and roared down the street. It took almost a year and a half before Marjorie was able to get close to Hans again. Dorina and she were at a party when she saw him behind the bar. Since he and Marjorie separated, Hans has had a terrible time. His parents' marriage, which had not been good to begin with, was now rapidly deteriorating, and he was dragged right into the center of things. They mocked each other, shouted, and complained about each other to Hans, and when he spoke his mind, the other parent treated him like a leper for weeks. The breakup with Marjorie did not benefit his self-esteem and self-confidence. All this was eating him up, and to protect himself, he unconsciously built a wall of selfishness and indifference around himself. He also lost his carefree and cheerful demeanor and was on the verge of depression. Two women were on the receiving side of his change in character. Both ended their relationship because of his selfishness. He knew it was all his fault, but he was sure that a long-term relationship was not for him, and in his dark moods, he didn't care. He recently dropped out of school to pursue a full-time job and the opportunity to own his own place. At almost 20 years old, he moved into a small apartment in a rather shady neighborhood and met a woman who was insensitive to his dark moods and slowly broke down his barriers. Sometimes they were friends with benefits, but this woman absolutely refused to have any other relationship other than that. Marjorie had just broken up with someone who was cheating on her, and it hit her hard. She cried on the shoulder of Dorina, who was now happily married to Nick. It hurts, doesn't it, to be on the receiving end? This comment made her realize that she felt real remorse for what she did to Hans, rather than self-pity for getting caught. Sometime later at the party, Marjorie was shocked to see her ex-boyfriend helping behind the bar. Almost without breathing, she asked, Hans, how are you? Hans looked up from the beer counter. Hi, Marjorie, what do you want? With her heart pounding, she replied, I'll apologize to you in private. Hans gave her a chance to do this, and it felt like a huge stone had been lifted from her soul when Hans accepted her apology. That same night, she even wrote him a love letter. She poured her soul into him and begged him for a chance to prove that she had learned her lesson and would be completely faithful to him if they got back together. This was the beginning of a long journey to restore their relationship. In the conversation when they reconciled and became a couple again, Hans also told her that she had used her only get-out-of-jail card, and if she ever kissed another man again, he would immediately break off any relationship with her, no matter what it was. Marjorie accepted his promise and, again with tears in her eyes, solemnly swore to him that she would never do such a stupid thing again. At 22, he became the father of a son, and a year later, a daughter. Back in the present, albeit a few weeks later. Out of habit, Hans walked in from behind the house and through the garden gate of Dorina's house. Marjorie drove ahead in the car, and Hans walked away from the house. 15 miles was just over 4 hours' walk for him through the polders and the nature reserve that bordered them. He also needed time to think about how to get his marriage back on track. Was it worth saving him for Marjorie's sake, or should they get a divorce? As he walked along the house, he noticed movement outside the kitchen window and, being curious as always, he looked closely and saw his wife kissing his brother-in-law, and it was the kiss of true lovers. And at that moment, he realized that there were more problems in his marriage with Marjorie than he could even imagine. This sight foreshadowed the end of his marriage. Unnoticed and devastated, he walked further into the garden. Deep in thought, after a few minutes, he began to undo his shoelaces. Hans thought about how to solve this problem. He always trusted Nick as he trusted himself, and he also kissed Dorina on the lips, but never like this, in a passionate kiss. His initial reaction was to storm into the kitchen and ask Nick something he would remember. Something other than Marjorie's lips, and warn her about the impending divorce. Then, after thinking some more, he decided that he needed ironclad proof before taking any irreversible action, so he kept a low profile all evening. The only one who noticed his detachment was Dorina. At the end of the evening, she pulled him aside. "What happened? From the moment you arrived, you've been acting strange. I'm worried about what I saw today, but I hope everything will be fine." Dorina looked at Hans's face and said, "Just worried. I don't believe it. Something serious is going on." "Dear Dory, stop. Please stop. I can't talk about it now. Give me some time and space." With this answer, Dorina realized that a serious storm was developing. She swallowed and said, "As you wish, but please don't be a stranger and come talk to me, okay? I promise I'll talk to you as soon as I get my affairs in order." Hans kissed his sister-in-law and whispered, "You know that I love you like an older sister, don't you?" "Just like I love you, little brother. Don't do anything stupid," she replied. The next day. On Sunday, when he had a day off, Hans usually got up long before the rest of the family, and this did not change even after the children left the house. He often used this watch for running. This morning was no exception, even though he hadn't slept well and it was still dark. His frustration and anger kept him awake, and at 5:30 he gave up, got out of bed, gathered his running clothes, and went downstairs. After a dose of coffee and a light breakfast, he put on his camelback and, since it was still dark, attached an LED flasher to it and hit the road. 10 minutes after warming up, he found his rhythm. His body began to jog, and his mind began to respond to the calming effect of the exercise, the familiar, continuous pattern of breathing, arm, and leg movements. Hans deliberately kept the pace relaxed so that his thoughts would not interfere with the concentration required to maintain a high pace. Random thoughts flowed through his mind. Almost unconsciously, he made a decision, and once it was made, a plan was formed. Almost 2 hours after he left, he turned into the street where the house he had long called his own was located. Still out of breath, he opened the door and found himself in a quiet house. Marjorie was still in bed. Not wanting to wake her, he went to the kitchen and made himself a drink to rehydrate himself during his run. Sitting at the kitchen table, he used an app on his phone and made 3 lists: what he wanted, what he needed, and what he needed to do. He wanted ironclad proof and divorce. He needs a lawyer, housing, or a place to disappear. If he chooses the latter, he will need a place to store his things. He needed to find a way to get proof. He needed to avoid the pitfalls of divorce proceedings and leave enough money to keep him afloat during the proceedings. Hans read about spy cameras and researched them on the internet. He soon received more information than he could handle, but it gave him an idea. From his parents, he inherited an antique stained glass bookcase that none of his siblings wanted to take. One of the glasses was removed because it was broken and was never replaced. The fact that there was no glass was barely noticeable against the background of the dark covers of the books. A spy camera would also be virtually invisible. Hans found a store that sold such devices just a few minutes before Marjorie entered the kitchen. She kissed him, but when he didn't react, she asked, "Why are you so gloomy? Is something bothering you?" "Yes," was the only answer. Marjorie was a little alarmed. Hans wasn't usually this irritable. She tried to calm him down by asking, "Can I help? Do you want to talk about this?" "Yes, when I'm ready. I need to figure this out myself, and when I do, you'll be the first to know," Hans said and walked up the stairs to take a shower. Marjorie swallowed. She trembled inside. Why is he so angry, and why doesn't he tell me what's bothering him? Is this something I did? With a cup of coffee in her hand and some toast in front of her, she tried to remember what could have happened to make Hans so angry. She kissed Nick, but Hans had not yet arrived. If he came and saw them kissing, there would be real hell. Freshened up and dressed in jeans and a t-shirt, he put on a leather jacket, grabbed a helmet, and announced, "I'm going for a ride." Shortly after, Marjorie heard the old BMW driving down the road. She sat up, her mind in turmoil. Something is very bad in Hans's soul. She knew it. Over all the years of marriage, she learned to read him like an open book. Hans took his more than 50-year-old BMW to a store where he found online spy cameras with motion detection that could be connected to his home Wi-Fi network and upload recordings to the cloud. He discovered the store was open and bought 2 cameras, one for the living room and one for the bedroom. He assumed that the other rooms of the house were not comfortable enough for 2 traders, and there was no place in the kitchen where he could hide a camera. By noon, he returned. He noticed that Marjorie was avoiding him, and that suited him just fine. In the privacy of his office, he created cloud storage and connected the cameras to the network, which was used for guests in the house when they needed internet access. He did this to avoid connection detection. The main network was regularly checked by his son Stefan for the presence of illegal users. The guest network had not been tested that thoroughly, and there were many users there, so there would be no issues in these murky waters. Marjorie cautiously looked out from behind the door. "I'm going to have coffee with Dorina. What do you want for dinner? I'll cook. Just right when you leave there." Marjorie left, and Hans immediately took advantage of her absence and installed 2 cameras. He checked to see if they were working properly. All he had to do was adjust the camera in the bookcase so that it had a clear view of the sofa and armchair, and he noticed that it was almost invisible. Now all that was left was to wait. Marjorie expressed her indignation to her older sister. "I don't know what's bothering Hans. Suddenly he became so cold towards me, and when I tried to get him to talk about what's bothering him, he just shut me down. I'm at my limit." Dorina listened to her sister's plaintive story and finally asked, "You didn't do something stupid, right?" "What kind?" "I don't know. I can imagine several options. I don't need to paint you a picture, do I?" With great effort, Marjorie kept her face calm. She felt numb inside. Dorina was extremely good at reading people. She had a successful career as an investigator in the Dutch Customs Service and thus also interviewed suspected smugglers. "Not that I realized," she replied. "Okay, your description of Hans's behavior is reminiscent of how he acted before that break before you 2 got married. Do you remember? I never gave Hans a reason to do this." "Then you have to find out why he behaves this way, and the only way to do that is to make him talk. I can try if you want." Marjorie perked up. "Really? I think you're the only one who can reach him. He would never dare to be angry with you." "That remains to be seen," Dorina replied, remembering the tense discussions they had had in the past. Hans could definitely be angry with her, but in a platonic sense, they were more than just best friends. They always parted as friends. "I'll call him and invite him for a walk with the bird watching in Ostvaardersplaats. He knows that I have access to places that are not open to the public." "It's a good idea. Shall I look at his schedule? We share a shared online calendar where he also updates his duty schedule. Comfortable. Let's. A few days later. Do you want to take a walk around the closed part of Ostvatersplassen? Of course, Hans replied. I'll check my schedule. No need. Marjorie and I had already chosen a date, and Nick suddenly had to go to another city for a project so I could spend time with my favorite brother-in-law. The temperature of Hans' voice dropped as he replied, suddenly. Darina did not notice this. She was in her own thoughts, thinking about how she could start to break through Hans's defenses and open him up to her. She took a deep breath and spoke. Something is bothering you, and I'm starting to guess what it is. Talk to me, Hans. Please talk to me. Sorry, Darina, no. I need to figure this out myself. Crap, thought Darina. Everything is worse than we thought. He is as closed as an oyster. He had never been so reserved. Not towards me. I need to be very careful next Monday. Next Monday, early morning. Darina carefully drove her car into the designated parking space, greeted the forester, and introduced Hans. When the forester gave them the obligatory instructions and some useful information, they set off. When they were far enough into the reserve, Darina began to carefully question Hans about his changes in attitude towards Marjorie. Hans fought off every attempt, and Darina became more and more desperate. She could always talk to her brother-in-law about anything, and he was also quite open with her. But not this time. She kept trying persistently, and every time she tried to open it, he retreated a little more and asked her more and more intensely to stop interrogating him. It was well past noon when she made another attempt, this time making it personal. Hans, she said, did I do something wrong? You have always been a compassionate, cheerful, and kind person, but now you act cold, distant, and grumpy. What's wrong with you? Hans went over the edge and snapped back. I'm fine. Now, excuse me, I'm tired of this interrogation. I thought I would have a relaxing day in good company. Looks like I made a mistake, so if you don't mind, I'm leaving and going home alone. You can call Marjorie to pick up the car or ask Nick to drive it back. I'm sure he wouldn't mind visiting Marjorie. Angry and seriously frustrated by the endless attempts to get him to open up, he walked away at a brisk pace. Darina sat down on a rotten tree trunk. She felt empty. She failed, and in her attempts also alienated her best friend. There was no way to catch up with him. He moved very quickly. In desperation, she tried to call him, only to find out that it was one of the few places in the Netherlands where there was no signal. She gave up and returned to her car. She estimated Hans would have about 25 miles to walk home, and he was able to maintain nearly 4 miles per hour over long distances, even after half a morning of walking and watching wildlife here. Taking a deep breath, she returned, got into her car, and drove home. Arriving home, Darina called Marjorie to say that she had been unable to get Hans to talk. Marjorie answered the phone immediately. Out of breath, she said, "Sister, what's new?" Darina did not miss the heavy breathing and tense note in her voice and answered with a question. "You sound out of breath. Is something wrong?" "Oh no, I had to run to answer the phone on time," came the reply. Snap! She answered before the phone rang twice. There was no running. This phone was lying next to her, and she almost sounded happy. Oh damn. A deep pit of fear formed in her stomach. She couldn't. She knows perfectly well what will happen if Hans catches her cheating. Is this the reason why he is so gloomy? "You're not doing anything stupid, are you? Like playing with another man?" "Of course not," Marjorie replied indignantly and changed the subject. "Did you find out anything?" "No. To make matters worse, I pushed too hard, and now your husband is mad at me." "He was never mad at you. Can't you make peace?" Almost in tears, with a trembling voice, Darina admitted, "I pushed so hard that he left me. I guess he's going back. He told me that you could pick up your car at our house and hinted that Nick would be willing to bring it to you." This shocked Marjorie, and it took her a great deal of effort to keep her voice in order while she frantically thought of a diversion. Finally, she replied, Maybe you can call Nick to come pick me up. We can have coffee, talk about how to get Hans out of his funk, and I'll return in our car. I have a spare key. It's a thought. I'll try to contact Nick, and Darina hung up. Nick, lying next to her, heard half the conversation and asked, "What is this all about?" Marjorie sighed. Hans has been in a terrible mood lately. He hardly talks to me, and when he does, it's only the most necessary things. On average, he completely ignores me. Just stop giving him affection. He'll come to his senses soon. Marjorie blushed, which didn't go unnoticed by Nick, but before he could ask why, his phone started ringing with Darina's ringtone. He motioned for Marjorie not to make a sound and replied, "Hey, honey, is something wrong? You never call me when I'm at work." He listened and responded, "Oh, do you know why?" Again, he listened to what Darina said. "Okay," and he lied, "I'm in Hoofddorp, and Marjorie is just a short detour. I'll take her." But what if Hans returns home to find the house empty? Is he walking home? Wow, he's angry. Okay, I'll leave in half an hour, pick up Marjorie, and be home in about an hour. Nick looked at Marjorie. "Where are we?" "Oh, yes. Don't give him affection. Why did you suddenly blush like a chameleon?" "I haven't touched it since." "Well, you know," she muttered in response. Stunned, Nick almost shouted, "What did you do? Oh, poor man. Why the hell did you do this? Has he suddenly become so disgusting? I know for sure that he is in better shape than me. We go to the sauna together so everyone can see it. I thought you wanted this, so that I can only be yours, and no, he's not disgusted with me. Then you better start showing him that you love him if you want to save your marriage. No one benefits from divorce, and that's exactly what you were going for, if I know Hans well enough." Marjorie contained her excitement and stood up. 45 minutes later, she was met by her sister. Darina was still worried and embarrassed by the reaction she had provoked. 5 hours later, after Hans had left Darina in the nature reserve, he was sitting in an ice cream parlor in Wiesp. In front of him, on a small table, stood a cup of coffee and ice cream. He found an empty table in the back of the establishment and was now looking at the recordings made by the spy cameras in the living room. What shocked him most was the ease with which they treated each other. Every touch and movement testified to a long-standing romance. Was he really that blind? He drank coffee and ate ice cream, not because he liked it, but because he needed coffee and calories during the last 90 minutes of the journey to the house where he lived. These records destroyed any idea of it as a home. Marjorie heard the key turn in the lock and hurried to the door to meet her husband. She was late. Hans had already entered the door and, without saying a word, sat down, untied his laces, took off his shoes, and still silently went into the bathroom. Marjorie followed him, but found that the bathroom was locked. Shocked to the core, she went to the kitchen. It was the first time since the children had left the house that Hans had locked the door. When he was finished in the bathroom, he went to bed, again without saying a word. Marjorie also went to bed and tried to talk to him, but it seemed to her that Hans had suddenly built a steel wall around himself, closed the gate, and thrown away the keys. Every attempt to speak to him was met with deafening silence. When she finally crawled under the covers, Hans was reading something on his tablet. Soon he turned away from her, put away the tablet, and tried to sleep. "Don't I deserve a kiss anymore?" she asked. "Since I know exactly what happened between your lips, I doubt that I will ever kiss you again," came the devastating and stunning answer. Hans was finally able to voice all the emotions accumulated in himself, and his voice sounded threatening, full of restrained anger. Marjorie literally recoiled. She leaned towards Hans, expecting at least a superficial kiss. She didn't expect a rude refusal. "What do you mean by that?" She demanded an explanation. "You're not stupid. You can figure it out for yourself. But as far as I'm concerned, this marriage no longer exists because someone forgot their promise to me and their wedding vows." Marjorie recoiled as if she had been hit, thinking in despair, He knows. What should I do now?" She tried to say something, but nothing came out except inarticulate sounds, to which Hans snorted contemptuously. No need. Don't even try to come up with excuses. Say that you love me, that you made a terrible mistake, and all other such nonsense. He turned away from her and, physically and mentally exhausted after that day, fell asleep almost immediately. Marjorie, however, could not sleep, her mind racing in circles in panic. She finally fell asleep from pure exhaustion. She woke up with a bang. The other side of the bed was empty and cold. She looked at her phone. Due to the stress of the previous day, she forgot to set the alarm and was now late for work. She had a good and well-paid job as an archivist in the city archives. She assisted people in their research into the city's history, which stretched back to the 13th century. She got out of bed and noticed that Hans had long since left. The coffee in the coffee maker has cooled down, and the dishwasher has finished its job. She called work, told her boss she had a family emergency, and asked for the day off. Permission was given immediately, with the possibility of extending the vacation until the end of the week. At the same time, Hans was negotiating his dismissal. The company he worked for was in dire straits, and Hans, with all his experience, was a valued employee. He had a strong position in the negotiations. Since he could no longer be fired according to Dutch law, he had very little time left before retirement. They made a deal. 1 month's salary before taxes for each year of service with the company. The company assumed obligations to pay taxes and other payments in this amount. This amounted to 42 months and was a very decent amount to be paid after Hans's divorce. He also had a reserve of unused vacation time. Unused vacation is considered deferred salary. This was also in his favor. The 3 months' notice was also covered by this leave. Suddenly, Hans found himself on vacation and soon without a job. It didn't bother him at all. It also significantly reduced the amount of child support he would have to pay. To avoid the obligation to work before reaching official retirement age, he accepted a job offer as a freelance maintenance worker through an employment agency and to pay his rent. His next step was to find a lawyer to handle and finalize the divorce. His first meeting with the lawyer was disappointing, to say the least. She first wanted him to try reconciliation and was very surprised when he asked her why he, as the initiator of the procedure, should try reconciliation. His wife had probably been unfaithful to him for a long time, and that was why he was sitting in front of her. Enraged, he walked out of the office, leaving behind a stunned woman. He had better luck with another lawyer. She was also a woman, but she had already been through all this. She understood his motivation and was happy to help. Together, they developed a proposal. The house was paid off and was worth a lot, easily $500,000, if not more, and half of it, according to the law, belonged to him. Marjorie could keep the house if she renounced further financial claims. Hans had no intention of returning there anyway. For him, it was a poison place. He drank coffee on a park bench. I made an access point on my phone, activated the firewall and VPN. Then I connected my tablet to the created Wi-Fi network, taking all the same precautions, and began to reorganize my finances. He also deleted his schedule of duties from their shared online calendar, blocked Marjorie from his personal calendar, contacts account, and logged out of their shared email account. Next, he began searching for affordable housing. He quickly learned that in and around large cities, it was impossible to find anything available on short notice. He eventually settled on temporary accommodation in Heerlen in Limburg. One-room apartment, kitchen, bathroom with shower and small toilet room just outside the entrance. He paid the deposit and 3 months' rent in advance. By lunchtime, he sat back, thinking gloomily, half a day of work and almost 40 years of marriage down the drain. Did a great job. After lunch, he began to think about how to get out of the house without being noticed or causing a scene. He no longer trusted himself in Marjorie's presence. Every time he remembered the footage from the hidden camera, everything began to boil inside him. He decided to look for temporary B&B accommodation. He found one available on the other side of town. Affordable because the house was directly under the landing route of planes landing at the airport. All his online activity did not go unnoticed by Marjorie. She was just checking to see if she could contact Hans through his work when she noticed that all the entries Hans had made on the calendar were disappearing at an ever-increasing rate. In desperation, she grabbed the phone and tried to call him. He didn't answer. She left a tearful message begging him to let her talk to him. Marjorie could not even imagine that she had already been caught red-handed and with sound, so she had no idea how deeply her betrayal affected Hans. Somewhere in the depths of her soul, she still hoped that by showing humility, tenderness, and willingness to do whatever he asked, Hans would soften and forgive her. The problem was that she couldn't find him. She tried to contact his work, but they told her that he was on vacation and that he did not have a work phone with him. She found his phone finder, but he had disabled the app on his device. Late that evening, Hans had not shown up, and Marjorie was now worried not so much that he would find out about her extramarital affairs with her brother-in-law, but that he might get into an accident and be injured or worse. Again and again she dialed his number, and again he did not answer. After a terrible night, she decided to call Nick. In any other situation, she would have called her sister, but she did not want to admit to cheating while revealing who exactly she was cheating with. Her sister would never stop interrogating her until she got an answer, and Marjorie had never been able to withstand such pressure. Nick swallowed the lump in his throat when Marjorie told him that Hans found out that she was cheating on him. He found an excuse at work and came straight away. "Did he tell you that he had evidence, or was it just an accusation?" he asked. Marjorie recalled that evening. It was an accusation formulated as if he had evidence. "And he didn't mention me." "If you think about it, no, I didn't mention it. I think he suspects something. He has a strong suspicion, but there is no evidence, and he is trying to force you to confess." "Do you really think so?" "If Hans had evidence, he would immediately show it to you and immediately tell Dorina. And in the process, he would probably rip my head off," he thought to himself. Nick tried to persuade Marjorie to sleep with him, but she was not in the mood. She snapped. "Is that all you can think about while Hans may have disappeared and my marriage hangs in the balance? A little excitement is not worth my marriage, so this is where it ends, and don't even think about hinting at meeting again." Nick understood everything perfectly. If Doreen finds out, he'll be single faster than he can look up the word divorce in the dictionary. Nick left the house, saying goodbye without the usual tenderness and kisses, unaware that this was also recorded. Later that morning, Louise called her mother. She got straight to the point. "Mom, I can't reach Dad. Our dryer broke down, and I hoped that Dad would be able to look at it. I have almost no space left to dry my clothes. I have the same problem. I can't contact your father. We have a conflict." But before Marjorie could finish her sentence, Louise interrupted her. "Are you home? I'll come now." Marjorie only had time to mutter an affirmative answer before Louise passed out. Half an hour later, her daughter flew into the house. One look at her mother, and she realized that the word conflict was a serious understatement. "You look like you've been squeezed dry. What's happening?" Marjorie desperately needed to talk. She needed someone who could get Hans to talk to her, someone who could walk through the door. Marjorie did not expect her daughter to understand or approve of her actions, but she needed her help to reach out to her husband. Pale as a sheet from fatigue, she sank into Hans's chair. Louise went to the kitchen and returned with cookies and tea. "I don't think you had breakfast." "Eat. You need it. Then you'll tell me what happened." Having recovered a little thanks to tea and calories, Marjorie, stumbling over her words and now deeply ashamed, told that she had cheated on Hans and about her fear that he would divorce her because of this. She twisted the story so that it seemed that the romance was spontaneous and short-lived. Marjorie and Louise were always inseparable and understood each other perfectly, but this time Louise almost left her mother. She was furious. Strangely, her anger was directed not so much at the betrayal, but at the possibility that the family would fall apart. But one look at her mother, and she changed her mind. The woman was so clearly upset and seemed repentant that Louise decided to persuade her father to reconcile. She had some ideas about this. After all, her father was a family man. It's been almost a week since Hans left home, and he still hasn't returned. He had bought himself some things and clothes to tide him over, and now he was waiting for Marjorie to leave for work. His anger and pain did not lessen, and the usually level-headed husband turned into a vindictive man who wanted his almost ex-wife to feel at least some of the pain that he felt. There was a truck around the corner to transport the bookcase, its watch, antique books, and some heirlooms to the locker. A few days ago, he bought himself a beat-up old Nissan van. He thought that this would be enough to transport his belongings to Heerlen. Marjorie walked out the door a few minutes after 8, and 15 minutes later Hans came into the house. Disassembling and dismantling the bookcase turned out to be the most labor-intensive, but after 3 hours of hard work, everything was packed into boxes, loaded, and sent to the storage room. The rest of his things were collected much faster, and at 12:30 he closed the door again. He threw his keys into the mailbox and headed to Heerlen. He arranged for the divorce papers to be delivered to Marjorie by registered mail directly to her work today. On the way to Heerlen, Hans reflected on his state of mind. He didn't want to go back to being the same person he was during their first breakup, and he realized with horror that he was already on the way to that. Damn, it's so easy to be that jerk again. I didn't even call Stefan and Louise to tell them what was happening. I need to work on this or find help, he thought, and decided to turn on the phone as soon as he was settled in his temporary housing. Hans was halfway to Heerlen when Marjorie received the biggest shock of her married life. She signed a receipt for a sealed beige envelope, stamped with her name and confidential, and requested. Curious, in the privacy of her floor-to-ceiling glass booth, she quickly opened the envelope. From there was a shot of her and Nick naked and kissing on the couch. A flash drive was glued to it. On it was written in tiny letters, "Best moments." Finally, she obtained a letter from a lawyer informing her that Hans Peters was filing for a divorce from Marjorie Peters Green. The cubicles were relatively soundproof, but her colleagues came running when she screamed in pain. She was sent home. One of her colleagues was kind enough to drive her home and quickly returned to the office. When Marjorie got out of the car, she wished her luck and quickly drove away. Marjorie entered the silent house. She felt that it was too quiet. She realized that Hans was several steps ahead of her and had already filed for divorce. It made her think, and most importantly, when he found out everything. When she walked into the living room, her jaw dropped and her heart immediately sank. Her books were neatly stacked in the gaping empty space where a large old bookcase had once stood. It was almost symbolic of her current life. The books stacked on the floor represented her, instead of being protected and supported by the secure bookcase symbolizing Hans. On the coffee table, she found a copy of her 40-year letter in which she promised Hans that from now on she would be faithful to him and only him, and his wedding ring. Suddenly, she realized why it was so terribly quiet. Hans took his grandfather's old watch. The sound of their heavy ticking permeated the house for decades. The next day, in Heerlen Mouth, Scarlet Hans sank heavily into a chair he found in a thrift store. Ugly, but convenient, and, most importantly, cheap. He bought a bed, a table with 2 chairs, and other fairly simple things. The interior was simple, but he didn't plan to stay here for long. He started looking for his phone. He must be somewhere. He hasn't touched the device since he left. When he found it, the battery was dead. He found a charger and put the phone on charge. As soon as current began flowing into the battery, the phone began to beep. Messages poured out like water from a broken dam. Hans turned off the sound in the messengers and went to bed. The night was hard again. Despite his fatigue, his mind was working at full capacity, and the main question was, why? Finally, to the sound of the first singing birds, he fell into a restless sleep. He woke up with a fright. Feeling disoriented, he tried to figure out where the noise was coming from. Felt stupid realizing it was his phone, and more specifically, a ringtone meant for his daughter. Still not quite awake, he answered the call. "Louise, you're so early." "Dad, it's already 9 o'clock. Oh, I see. I probably didn't sleep well. I understand how you feel. How are you generally feeling? Are you holding on? Things are not going very well, terribly. Mom told us everything. Are you really going to divorce her and break up your family? Who, me? Did I suddenly feel guilty? It was your mother who broke her wedding vows, not me. Dad, she made a mistake, and you didn't even talk to her. You just walked away and didn't even give her a chance to talk to you. Don't you understand that she's devastated? You need to reconcile. I know this feeling. How do you think it feels for me? And no, there will be no reconciliation. Louise tried a different approach. Dad, what about your wedding vows? You vowed to support your mom through good times and bad. These are bad times. Why don't you honor this oath? We also swore to renounce everyone else. Look where this got me. Louise's anger flared. Dad, you need to talk to Mom and give her a chance. I've already done it. Once should be enough. Dad, you better talk to Mom. Do I feel threatened if I refuse? You better stay away from us and our children. You won't be welcome until you talk to your mom about reconciliation. Blackmail. Let it be so. Hans passed out. Louise looked at the phone. He hung up. Crap, he just hung up. Oh God, is he really that angry? Another thought appeared. Of course he is angry. His wife cheated on him. It will soon cool down. He is still a reasonable person. Still looking at the phone in her hand, her thoughts continued to flow. In any case, I gave him a reason to think about it carefully. When his connection with his grandchildren may be disrupted, I'll tell Mom and Stefan how it went. Mom should keep her phone handy. Hans also looked at his phone. Feeling even more betrayed than before, he felt the sensation begin to radiate into his body. He felt nauseous, dizzy, and feverish. He lay on his back as tears filled his eyes. The pain of Louise's ultimatum was intense, but he was not going to give in to blackmail. As he thought about it, he became convinced that Marjorie had not told them the whole story. He should have told Louise this, but he was too sleepy to insist and get his point across. Moreover, his innate reluctance to argue again played a cruel joke on him. I'm not going to give in to blackmail. Stefan and Louise will have to explain themselves when their elders start asking difficult questions about why their grandfather is missing. In any case, in 2 years they will be 18, and I will be able to contact them myself. With a deep sigh, he rose from the bed. He still needed to find some work. That evening, Marjorie spoke with her children, daughter-in-law Lucy and son-in-law Brian. She showed the divorce papers and Hans' proposal for the division of property. The photograph attached to the documents, of course, was not shown. It wasn't even possible. She burned it in the hope that similar photographs would never appear again. I talked to Dad this morning, Louise announced. Marjorie perked up. Is he okay? What did he sound like? I woke him up, and he didn't sound very good. He confirmed that he couldn't handle it. These were his own words. You called so early? Stefan asked. It was already after 9. You can expect that people are already on their feet. I gave him a morning call. Marjorie intervened, sensing the sudden tension between brother and sister. While Louise didn't approve of what she did, Stefan was furious and refused to talk to her until that evening, and he was only here because his wife talked him into it. Before Louise arrived, Stefan gave her a complete dressing down. He was definitely on his father's side. Hans usually gets up early. 6 hours for him means he can sleep longer. Did he say why he wasn't up? Something about a bad night. Anyway, we talked, and I told Dad that he should talk to you, Mom, and not leave like a child. Stefan turned white, and only Lucy's hand holding him prevented him from exploding. Brian suddenly looked closely at his wife. Marjorie swallowed and said, I cheated and seriously hurt your father. I broke his trust and broke my promises to him. It's my fault he's not here, not his. He has every reason not to be here, and he is not a coward. Is it clear? The fact that her mother took all the blame and defended her father's actions was completely lost on Louise when she said, I gave him an ultimatum. I think he will call you soon, Mom. Stefan asked with dangerous calm. And what was this ultimatum? Marjorie and Lucy heard the danger. Stefan was very similar to his father, but he lacked some of the reserves that were inherent in his father, such as a reluctance to argue and express strong opinions. Another difference between the two men was that Stefan's character was like a compressed spring that can only be compressed to a certain point before it returns to its original state, while Hans was more like a spring that abruptly bursts when the load gets too high, and when that happens, there is no way back. Louise, however, was much like her mother, impulsive, self-confident, and sometimes too convinced that she is right, that he is not welcome until he talks about reconciliation with his mother, and until he does this, he should stay away from us. Louise answered with satisfaction. I hope you didn't include me, Lucy, or our children in this. I don't want anything to do with your games. Less confident now, Louise replied. Not in those words. But Dad needs to talk to Mom, and if that's what it takes. Stefan exploded. Are you crazy? How dare you? Mom cheated on Dad. Mom broke her wedding vows. You treat Dad like he's a spoiled child whose toys were taken away, and you make me an accomplice. He pulled his phone out of his pants pocket and desperately tried to call his father. Stefan turned pale and pressed the speakerphone button. This number is currently unavailable. Please try again later, came from the speaker. Lucy held her husband until he calmed down a little and then said, You know, Louise, you not only deprived your father of his children and grandchildren, but also deprived our children of their grandfather, and you did it knowing how much they loved him. They all adore him, and so do yours. I think this is unforgivable. For now, we don't want to have anything to do with you and your little intrigues. You can come and talk to us when you find him again and get him to talk to us again. If I know your father well, he will simply leave, no matter how painful it is for him. Lucy knew her father-in-law really well. Hans had already been looking for a job, and recent events had caused him to cast his net wider and wider until he found a job that he thought he might like. Stefan and Lucy said goodbye, and a few minutes later Marjorie was left alone with Louise and Brian. She sighed and said, Louise, you have no idea how wrong you were in trying to force your father into submission. Just because he doesn't like to argue doesn't make him a weakling. It's entirely possible that you'll never see your father again simply because you assumed that this was the first time I jeopardized our relationship. Let me show you something and tell you that this marriage almost didn't work out, and that too was because of my stupidity. Marjorie gave her daughter a copy of the letter she had written before their reconciliation and before their wedding. Louise began to read, and the further she went, the paler she became. White as a sheet, she returned the letter to her mother's hands. He told me, she said. He told me, I've already done this once. This should be enough. Brian's face looked like a thundercloud. Marjorie gave him the letter to read too. He didn't read it all the way, but he did enough to understand what it said. In a voice hoarse with anger, he said, We're going home, wife, and there we will have a conversation about interference, coercion, wedding vows, and marital fidelity. You don't seem to understand the depth of their meaning, or don't take them seriously enough. The latter could be the end of another marriage in this family. Better think about it seriously on the way home. I have serious questions, and you have even more serious problems. The next morning, with a deep sigh of relief, Hans hung up. He found a job. A job that suited him well was doing repairs and maintenance at a campsite in Germany. The campsite, Sicht am Tal, needed a versatile service technician, male or female, for at least one season. Housing and food were provided. It was not the highest salary, but he had almost no operating expenses, and he knew and liked Odenwald well. Now he had one more thing to do, the most difficult conversation of all this time. He had to tell Darina that her husband was cheating on her with her sister. Shuddering at the thought, he sighed and picked up the phone again. It's Doreen's phone, but it's Nick speaking. I need to talk to your wife, traitor. Hans, let's behave in a civilized manner. Why should I? Pass the phone to Darina. You're not going to ruin my marriage, are you? You ruined mine by having sex with my wife, and I think my best friend has a right to know what kind of creep she's married to. If I don't give her the phone, you won't be able to talk to her. So why should I do this? Because I'm not going to tell her on the phone, you freak. I'll tell her personally. If you give her the phone, I can make an appointment and you can leave when I arrive. If you don't do this, I will come without warning, and there is a chance that we will come face to face. In this case, I will tear off what is between your legs and feed them to you after first knocking out your teeth. At the moment, I don't care if I end up in prison because my family has already turned their backs on me. Damn, he really knows everything. I greatly underestimated him. Damn, 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 and he is actually able to carry out his threat. He's much stronger than me. Nick thought in panic and handed the phone to Dorina, only saying, Hans wants to talk to you. Hans, where are you? What's happening? Marjorie didn't tell you. I left and I want to explain to you why, personally. Can I come tomorrow? You can come right now. I think Nick wants to know too. I'm not around. Tomorrow? Around 10. You make the coffee and I'll bring the Vly. Okay, I'll tell Nick. You will do it, Hans thought out loud after he ended the call. I'll have to get up early if I want to make it on time. Hans decided not to use the van. He barely made it to Heerlen. Instead, he took the train and walked from Hulensch radio station to Doreen's house. He knocked on the door and waited. He had a Vly in his hands, and in his pocket several frames where Marjorie and Nick were in very compromising positions, and a flash drive with recordings. He didn't plan to show it, but he wouldn't hesitate if the right circumstances arose. He needed to convince her that this affair had been going on for a very long time. All this time, he didn't want this conversation. The door opened and Doreen threw herself into his arms, almost dropping her howl. I missed you. Now will you tell me what's going on? Marjorie doesn't tell me anything. I tried to call Louise and she just burst into tears and then immediately hung up. What's so bad that they don't want to tell me anything? I'll tell you everything, but you won't like it. Can I come in? Doreen led him inside, as she had done many times before, but this time she did not let him go and kept her hand on his belt, afraid that he would leave again. When they were comfortably seated, she busied herself with the coffee pot and barking. Returning to the living room, she sat down next to Hans. Tell me, she demanded. Hans took her hands, swallowing. I'm divorcing your sister, he said simply. What? Why? She changed. She has a long-term affair with someone. No. Are you sure? Wasn't this a one-time thing? You know she can be impulsive. No, when I began to suspect something, I installed 2 hidden cameras, and the recordings turned out to be extremely destructive. Do you know who her lover is? Alas, yes, and that's what makes this conversation so difficult. You know him too. Unfortunately, it's Nick. Doreen's hands flew to her mouth. No, she whispered. Hans showed her the pictures, and Doreen took them in a daze. She inhaled sharply, looking at them. She asked, You already knew when I tried to draw you out of your shell, didn't you? Not exactly. I saw them kissing the last time we came before the trip to Ostfahrtsplassen, and it wasn't an easy light kiss. It was a full-blown kiss between 2 long-time lovers. Just before we went bird watching, I set up the cameras right before we went birding, and I tiptoed around that entire day. You kept pressuring me, and I wanted proof before I spoke. I still had hope that I had misunderstood something, and I didn't want to create chaos based on a misunderstanding. What are you going to do? I guess the divorce is already a done deal since she hurt you twice. I'm leaving today. I have a job in Germany, and my lawyer knows what to do. Yesterday, Louise told me that if I don't talk to Marjorie and make peace with her, I won't be able to see my grandchildren anymore. I'm not going to talk to Marjorie, and I hope that in 2 years my grandchildren will want to talk to me, because by then they will be 18 years old, and no one will be able to stop them. I also think Stefan and Louise don't know it's Nick who Marjorie is cheating with, and I'm not going to tell them. This is Marjorie's business. You, however, are my big sister and should know what is going on behind your back, even if there is a chance that you will never want to see me again. Doreen's emotions were completely uncontrollable. Anger, sadness, helplessness, betrayal, and confusion, But one thing she was sure of. She knew that her brother-in-law loved her. He was the bearer of perhaps the most terrible news imaginable, and he risked the possibility that she would no longer want him in her life. She looked at Hans, who silently awaited his fate, not broken, but almost on the edge. If she judges him too, it will be easier for him to step under the train than to sit on it. Suddenly, her emotions thickened, and she began to think straight again. It's not Hans's fault. He told me because he loves me, and he, like me, needs comfort. Darling, give me my phone. With great relief, Hans noticed this affectionate address and realized that everything would be fine between them. She dialed her husband's number, and when Nick answered, she began without any preamble. You damned idiot burning in hell. Nick was expecting a call and wanted to put the blame on Marjorie and pretend it was a one-time thing. He didn't stand a chance. No chance at all. Shut up and listen. Don't come home. Hans is here, and I think he'll tear you apart if you show up. As for me, don't ever come back here. Go sleep with that bitch, my ex-sister, or under a bridge, or in a box. I don't care. Hans will stay here for the night. I'll try a real instrument, not a toy one like yours. We both need comfort, and I definitely intend to comfort Hans in my bed. Hans's face turned crimson when he heard what Doreen said to Nick, but she didn't finish. With his help, I'll collect your things and throw them in the alley. Tomorrow afternoon, I'll help Hans get to the station because he won't be able to walk properly after I'm done with him. Doreen listened to the pleas on the other end of the line, laughed loudly, and hissed. No way. Consider yourself divorced. She turned back to Hans. So, where are we? She giggled when she saw Hans' shocked face. She smiled and said, Hans, the biggest mistake I made was letting you go the first time my sister did something stupid. I have always loved you, and now I demand at least one night with you. She stood up, pulled her sweater over her head, unbuttoned her jeans, and let them fall to her ankles. Hans watched with his mouth open, unable to say a word, while Doreen reached behind her back, unclasped her bra, and kicked off her panties. She almost strode towards Hans, confident that she still had a toned body for a woman her age. She was a keen gymnast and folk dancer, and it showed. Hans felt her body acutely. A slender neck, broad shoulders, small but firm breasts, a flat stomach showing only small traces of 2 pregnancies, well-groomed hair, and strong and beautiful legs, and this whole complex came to him with one goal, not to be rejected. She sat on his lap, pulled his head towards her, and said, I love you, Hans. I have always loved you, and I want at least one night with you and make love to you. Please, I beg you, don't deny me this. Hans accepted the inevitable and gently pulled her towards him. Doreen opened her eyes and listened to the soft breathing of the man next to her. My sister is a complete idiot, she thought. She felt the anger return, and it was something she didn't want, so she remembered last night and evening. Nick and Hans were roughly equal in skill, but that was where the comparison ended. Firstly, Hans was much better endowed with nature than her almost ex-husband. Besides, having sex with Nick felt a little mechanical, like a casual hookup where you're just relieving tension. With Hans, after he got over his initial shyness, it was passionate and loving. There were also physical differences. Nick was a clerk who hardly cared about his uniform. One training session and football game a week, and some heavy lifting in the form of lifting beers after the game with friends. Hans was the complete physical opposite of Nick. His job as a highly skilled maintenance engineer and hands-on approach to work gave him a strong body to begin with, and he was physically active. He was a little overweight, but he was and always remained in much better shape than her sister's lover. Overall, she had a nice, used feeling in her lower region, and that was something she had been missing for a long time. She knew that when Hans woke up, they would soon be separated, and a repeat of this night was unlikely. She smiled and thought, what vengeful sex. He definitely gave me a night to remember. A memory that will comfort me during the difficult months ahead. I will miss him. After breakfast, they had another good conversation about their future. Hans told her that he would change providers and keep in contact as long as she did not tell his family where he was or how he was doing. For now, he wanted nothing to do with them, no matter how painful the decision was. They hugged one last time on the couch and talked about what happened between them last night. Both felt a little guilty because they were both married, but not to each other. But at the same time, both were happy because they finally gave in to the love they had for each other. And because of this, it was a wonderful night for both of them. They assured each other that this was an isolated incident, otherwise their friendship could be damaged if it happened again. This was something they both did not want to risk for anything. Around noon, they parted at the station. Hans walked towards the train without looking back. Both were unaware of the other's wet eyes, painfully watching the end of their lives as they knew it. Hans is gone, and two marriages are in jeopardy due to the selfish actions of their spouses. 2 years later, Hans walked around the Siegt Emtal site, checking what work could be done there. The owner told him that she had hired two young Dutchmen to help him during the peak summer holidays. He really liked this idea. Last year, he worked as hard as he could just to get through the day-to-day, and when the rush started to subside again, to clear the backlog of maintenance. Campsite owner Frau Eberstein was widowed 5 years ago when her husband did not follow safety rules when installing a steel frame for the bathroom. The steel I-beam slid off the tackle and crushed his skull. He didn't wear a helmet because he thought it was too warm. This reserved man immediately liked Hilda. He barely spoke for the first few months, but his work was of a high standard and always on time. It was only because of bad weather and uninvited guests that he was sometimes late. When he finally began to open up to her, she learned the whole story. She was shocked and tears appeared in the corners of her eyes. She knew how much pain Hans felt. Her husband also cheated on her with a guest at the campsite, and they were also getting divorced when his accident happened. After a few months, she wanted nothing more than to hold this man in her arms and comfort him as best she could. Searching for an opportunity, she finally got her chance when Hans had a minor accident. He went too far and fell into a septic tank on the campsite that serves the bathhouse and toilets. She saw it happen, helped him, and asked if he had swallowed anything. When he answered in the negative, she pushed him into the shower stall, turned on the water, and began to undress him. Because Hans was dragged into the shower, she also got all dirty. Without thinking twice, she undressed and stood naked under the streams of water rubbing against Hans. His bodily reaction was immediate. There were few guests, since it was still the pre-season, and it was possible to do without them for some time. She closed the door and turned her attention to him. Days later, some of the guests were still grinning when they saw her, remembering her passionate cries coming from the bathhouse. From this point on, Hans had to provide another type of service. Repairman with benefits for life. Both weren't ready for a relationship yet, but both needed intimacy and sexual relief. Hans and Hilda talked about this for a long time, honestly and openly. They both agreed that being in a relationship together was not in the books, and if anyone came their way, they would part ways as dear friends. Kevin and Rita were cold, tired, and wet. The last stretch to Siegt Emtal was difficult. The road was uphill, and the weather was merciless. Heavy rain and headwinds almost killed them. Cycling in these circumstances was terrifying. They entered the reception area, or rather, they staggered inside. Hilda jumped up and shouted, "Oh, my poor things, come in." After introductions, they sat comfortably and wearily waited for the promised hot chocolate. When a man walked in with a tray filled with two steaming mugs and the German delicacy Bienensteich, both looked up. Rita was the first to recognize him. "Grandfather?" Shocked and slightly trembling, Hans carefully placed the tray on the table and asked, "Rita, Kevin, what are you doing here? How did you find me?" Both young men were already on their feet, forgetting about fatigue, when they hugged him tightly. All three started talking at the same time and started laughing until Hans spoke. "First, let's take off these wet clothes and warm you up. In the meantime, you have an apartment above the sanitary building. It's quite cozy and private." Hans showed them to their accommodation, and said that he would have something to eat for them when they changed clothes. He then apologized, saying that he still had work to do. Kevin looked around his room and wondered what to do. He knew about the family breakdown, although he didn't know exactly what happened when his grandfather disappeared and his father no longer spoke to his aunt. As far as Kevin knew, his father barely spoke to his own mother, but he knew that his father desperately missed his grandfather. He sat on the bed and came to the conclusion that there was only one correct decision. He took the phone and called his father. "Well, hello, Kevin. Did you two arrive safely?" "Yes, Dad, and I also have different news." "Oops here. We're going to have dinner with him in a few minutes." He was silent for a few moments before Stefan responded. "What? Have you spoken to him? How is he doing? Is he okay? Can I talk to him? I only spoke to him for a few minutes, so I don't know if he's okay, but he looks good. Lean and strong, tanned and relaxed." "I can't give him a phone because he's at a construction site doing household chores. See you at dinner. Can I ask him to call you?" "No, I have a better idea. I'll come alone to talk to him tomorrow. He might still be mad at us, so please don't say I'm coming." "Is it true? Okay, I'll keep my mouth shut. I guess I'll see you tomorrow." Hans, Hilda, and two young men were having dinner. Hilda was delighted with the two young people. Smart, polite, well-educated, fluent in German and English, and Rita even spoke a little French. They talked about home, school, parents, brothers, and sisters. Hans remained silent. Thanks to this, he learned a lot about what happened during his absence. The next morning, Hans got up early. His cousins were still asleep when he began his rounds. Hilda took care of the administration and responded to booking requests. Mid-morning, Kevin came to help him, while Rita helped Hilda at the reception. Kevin was mowing the vacant fields and Hans was trimming the hedges when Rita wrote to Hans that he had visitors. He left Kevin to do his business and returned to the waiting room. Upon entering, he was immediately ambushed by Lucy. She came up behind him, and when he turned around, she pulled him into a bear hug and sobbed, "Please, Daddy, please listen to what we need to tell you." What are you doing here, Lucy? Are you alone, or is Stefan here too?" He felt his daughter-in-law nodding on his chest, and he felt as if he was in a vice. Hans's anger gave way to a dull throb. All that was left was a sharp, jagged pain, so he answered softly, "I'll listen. First, say hello to Kevin. I assume you've seen Rita. After that, we'll talk while we eat, if you don't mind." Behind him, he heard his son's answer. "Yes, Dad, as long as you give us a chance to talk to you." Hans, who was still being held tightly by Lucy, turned to look at his extremely agitated son. Freeing one hand, he said hoarsely, "Come here." This is exactly how Hilda found them three adults, overcome with strong emotions, hugging each other and not wanting to let each other go. She walked up to them and kissed Hans on the cheek to get his attention. When he looked at her with his eyes red from tears, she said softly, "I'll prepare dinner. Then you can introduce us, and after dinner you can do whatever you need to do." Kevin entered the kitchen, where Hilda had already prepared a variety of German delicacies, and Hans noticed that Kevin was not at all surprised to see his parents. Of course, he called my father and told him that he had found me. How could I be so stupid and not take into account that he would do this, he thought, and felt unexpected calm from this thought. After lunch, Hilda sent the youth to work and left, citing the fact that she needed to keep an eye on the contractor. Hans smiled to himself because there was no contractor on the premises and had not appeared since he himself was engaged in all the repair work. The three were sitting at a table in the shade of a large awning when Hans looked at Stefan and said, "Okay, I'm listening." Lucy spoke first. "Dad, we didn't know about Louise's ultimatum, and we would never have agreed to it. When she told us all what she had done, Stefan was furious, as was I. I told her not to contact us until she talked to you. We saw her several times, but refused to communicate. However, we did not prohibit our children from communicating with her. That's why the terrible twins work here for the holidays." Hans felt his thoughts begin to wander at this revelation. Louise had persistently hinted that she was speaking for both siblings, and it turned out that he had missed out on his son and grandchildren because of half-truths. He was overcome with anger. But before he could react, Stefan continued, "Don't get too excited, Dad." Louise's outburst left their marriage hanging by a thread. Brian took it very badly and is still furious with her. He was so angry at that moment that he immediately wanted to divorce her, saying that her lax attitude towards marriage vows was already a recipe for disaster in the future, and he did not want to experience the grief that you were experiencing. Stefan took a shaky breath as Lucy said softly, "I think you're the only one who can save this marriage. Brian still thinks of you as the father he never had." "I'll think about it. It means I'll have to go back. I don't like it. I really like it here." "But there are other reasons to come back, Dad," Lucy said. "Those two at the campsite want to walk the Kennedy March. They just told us that they are going to ask you to be their coach and go with them. There are other grandchildren who urgently need an active grandfather. So there are many reasons." Hans appreciated Lucy's arguments, thought them over, and said, "I need to discuss this with Hilda. She was not just an employer for me. She helped me get on my feet, and I am not going to leave her here in the middle of the season." Lucy walked around the table, kissed him on the cheek, and said quietly, "You've already made your decision. You just don't know it yet. I'll find you a place to live, next to us." She winked and returned to her husband and kissed him passionately. "This is for giving me such a wonderful father-in-law." Stefan and Lucy stayed one night in one of the empty houses. In the morning, before Stefan and Lucy returned home, Hans spoke to Hilda at breakfast. Before he could start talking, Hilda interrupted him. "You're leaving, aren't you?" Hans stammered, "I'm thinking about it, but I'd like to know your opinion." Hilda stood up. "Come here," she ordered. As Hans came closer, she hugged him. "We had a good time. We helped each other overcome bitterness, and I love you for that, but it looks like it's time to part ways. I overheard parts of your conversation with your son and daughter-in-law. You know the office is not soundproof, and neither is the kitchen. They love you, miss you, and need you. You will always have a special place in my heart, but I'll find someone else to run the campground for, and maybe someone else for myself too." Hans almost cried and replied, "You don't need to be in a hurry. I won't leave until the end of the season until everything is clear. Say, in early November." Hilda hugged him so that he took his breath away. "You are a true friend. I will reward you for that tonight." End of November, same year. Hans looked around his new home. He gave Lucy a budget, and she kept her promise without disappointing him. The house was next to a small nature reserve, had stunning views, and was affordable. He thought, "It's time to come out of my self-imposed exile and rejoin society." Stefan, Lucy, and their two children were having dinner at Hans's apartment. After the children had gone about their business, the three adults made themselves comfortable in the living room. "Dad," Lucy said with her usual bluntness, "it's time for you to tie up some unfinished business. You need closure with Marjorie first, and secondly with Louise and Brian. Louise was very stupid with her ultimatum, but she never crossed the line and did not cheat on Brian. Brian now misses you a lot and blames Louise for it. The other problem in their marriage is that since she protected Marjorie, he no longer trusts her blindly like he used to, and it's taking its toll. Any less strong marriage would have ended long ago. Even though Louise did you wrong, she doesn't deserve to be a divorcee." Hans thought about his daughter-in-law's request. "I'll call Brian," Hans answered slowly, trying to find the right words. "Louise is forgiven, but I will never forget her attempt to blackmail me for the sake of reconciliation. I know that she did it with the best intentions without knowing all the facts. But why should I seek closure with Marjorie? Obviously, she had a long-term affair with that bastard, and she completely cut me off from any, and I mean any, physical intimacy. She didn't even want to scratch my back. She continued to do this despite being absolutely certain that as soon as I found out, it would be the end of our marriage. I know that we cannot avoid each other, and if we bump into each other at any family event or official meetings, I will behave like any decent person. But no more than that, do not expect entertainment or even light conversation from me. This was what Lucy and Stefan were expecting, the night before they had discussed the possibility of a reunion. Ansa with the rest of the family and agreed that this would be the best outcome. They also decided that Lucy would bring up the topic because, from the moment Stefan introduced her to his parents, it was as if she had a direct connection to Hans' heart and vice versa. Marjorie, however, was not thrilled with her future daughter-in-law, who had a strong character and high intelligence, but accepted her after seeing how good Lucy was for her son. Stefan said thoughtfully, "Now I have to tell my mother about this, and she won't like it. She still hopes for reconciliation." "No, it's my job. Just be open and honest about whatever she asks. I don't want to hide anything anymore. Say the same to Louise and Brian. Give them my phone number and address. They'll know where to find me." A few days later, Hans opened the door for his daughter. "Hello, Louise. Come in from the cold," Hans invited. "Where's Brian?" A very worried Louise replied, "I thought it would be better to talk to you first. What I did was unforgivable." Her eyes began to shine with tears, and Hans saw that this adult woman, the mother of almost all adult children, was on the verge of a breakdown. He gently helped her take off her coat and led her into the living room. "Still just tea, no coffee, I guess. I have some wonderful jasmine green tea you might like." When Louise looked at him, he saw a glimmer of hope in her eyes. He spoke. "Louise, we need to clear things up. I'm not going to disown you. You are still my daughter, but I really want to know why you tried to blackmail me for the sake of reconciliation. I thought you knew me better than to do this." He headed to the kitchen and started making tea and his freshly baked raisin and chocolate cookies. When he returned with a tray of tea, cups, and biscuits, Louise had already come to her senses. "Dad," she began, "I really don't know what came over me to do this. It was hasty, thoughtless, and downright stupid. I only know that Mom was beside herself with fear. When I called you, you were abrupt and did not make contact. Now I understand why, but then I did not know the whole situation. Mom only told us that you caught her cheating. She didn't say it was Nick and kept it a secret for a long time. She never told us that she was stupid once before. We all heard about it later that same day, in the evening after our conversation. By then, it was too late. You were gone. Even Aunt Sorry didn't know where you went. It turned out much worse than you imagined, didn't it?" Louise put her head in her hands before answering in a quiet voice, "Yes, that's what happened. Stefan and Lucy stopped talking to me, and it was only after a year that Lucy softened a little and began to reconnect. Mind you, they never stopped the children from dating. My marriage is a struggle. I can't convince Brian that I'm not as stupid as my mother. I will never cheat on him. That thought never crossed my mind. I love him too much, and now that I've seen one good marriage ruined, I would think 10 times before even thinking about it. But Brian doesn't believe me anymore." Hans heard the despair in Louise's voice. "Talk to him? Try to convince him." Louise perked up. "Would you do that?" "Of course. You are still my daughter. Sometimes you do very stupid things, but never out of malice. I just hope that you have learned to think before you act." Do you forgive me?" Louise asked stammeringly, not believing her ears. "Yes, I forgive you. Now come here and hug me. It's been too long since I held my daughter in my arms." They hugged each other for a long time before Louise asked, "Do you mind if I call Brian and ask if he wants to come?" "Of course not." Brian arrived within an hour, and Hans and Louise had time to begin re-establishing contact. Hugging his brother-in-law, Hans said softly, "I think we need to talk a little about your marriage, don't you?" An unsure Brian replied, "If you say so." Hans turned to Louise and said, "We will be on the balcony. It won't take long." They both put on their coats and went outside. Hans decided to approach the problem directly and be frank. "Do you still love my daughter?" he began. "Yes, sir." "Sir? Where did this come from? Are you mad at me?" "No, see, ugh, Dad, I thought you were mad at me." "No, son, I'm not angry." "So you two love each other, but you have problems with the way Louise handled the situation, right?" Brian nodded, and Hans continued. "Your wife, my daughter, is not her mother. Take my word for it. Yes, she is just as impulsive, but unlike her mother, she is incredibly loyal. My behavior at that time made her impulsively put this ultimatum. She saw her mother suffer, did not know the whole story, and made too many conclusions. By the time she was put in her place, it was too late to fix anything. In my anger and frustration, I thought, fuck this, and disappeared. Believe me, she is as true to her marriage vows as I am. I think part of her coming here is out of love for you in the hope that I have a conversation with you." Brian looked at the stunning view without seeing it. The wheels in his head were spinning furiously. Louise had never given him any reason to doubt her before she pulled this prank. During their confrontation at home, she was in a real panic and almost screamed that she would never cheat because they are married, she loves him, and she is not her mother. Something clicked in his mind, and he felt as if he had been stabbed with a knife. He ran inside and fell to his knees. "Please forgive me. Forgive me. I was so stupid." Louise fell to her knees next to him, kissed him on the cheek, and asked, "Does this mean that I have my husband back, without reservations?" "I should never have had those reservations. Your father put me in my place. I was so stupid that I didn't see that you were you and not your mother." Hans remained on the balcony until he froze. In the kitchen, he looked into the living room and thought with satisfaction, mission accomplished. It's time to send the lovebirds home. He cleared his throat, and when he finally got their attention, he smiled and remarked, "You probably need more privacy than my house can provide. Get out. Go home." The couple released each other and, without saying a word, pulled hands into a group hug. Louise was so excited that she could barely utter the words, "Thank you, Dad, for putting us on the right path." "It's okay, baby. I'm glad to see you two are back together. Now go home and get reacquainted. Your marriage needs some serious TLC." Hans closed the door behind them and sighed. He would call Doreen tomorrow, and he expected that Marjorie would also show herself soon, and he was not at all looking forward to this conversation. The next day after lunch, Hans arrived in Holland's Rating and knocked on Doreen's door. Doreen opened the door, somewhat nervously, and didn't hug him like before. She invited him inside, and when he took off his jacket, she whispered, "I want to introduce you to my friend. This means that we are talking about dating only each other. I don't know how he will react to you." "Really, Dory? What good news. I'm very happy for you. So, will you introduce me to your new suitor?" Doreen's relief was evident throughout her entire being. "Do you mind?" she asked. "Of course not. After this whole sordid affair, I always hoped that you would find someone worthy of you. I will be the last person to deprive you of your happiness. If necessary, we will reduce the need our physical contact to the level that will be comfortable for your man. Hans, I love you so much. You're the best son-in-law I've ever had." After a while, Hans happily hummed Tom Waits' Waltzing Matilda as he worked on his rye bread. He divided the dough into 2 equal parts and added water, rye flour, and flour to each. Tomorrow he will have enough for the entire cooking club. Each member will have enough for 1 loaf of bread. Hans had always been a good cook, and he thought the club was a great opportunity to socialize. He was just drying his hands when the doorbell rang. Since he became a member of the club, such cases were not uncommon, as some of the ladies found out that he was divorced. The hunting season for Hans Peters began immediately, much to his delight. He was open about the fact that he was not interested in a relationship of any kind. However, this did not in the least diminish the ladies' ambitions to get him into their arms. He opened the door and saw a determined Marjorie standing in front of him. Marjorie examined him carefully. It had been almost 3 years since she had last seen him. He was dressed in jeans and a t-shirt. Muscular arms ended in strong, thin, calloused hands. The t-shirt fits snugly to the torso, emphasizing the well-defined pectoral muscles. Secretly, she hoped that, like last time, his anger had subsided so much that the love he had left would take over and he would want it back. "Hi, Hans. You look good. Can I come in?" "No." The message, although spoken softly, was loud and clear. All hopes for reconciliation were destroyed. "But we need to talk. I don't owe you anything, but if you want to talk, let's talk somewhere else. There's a coffee shop in the mall down the street. I'll meet you there in half an hour. There's some business I need to finish here." Embarrassed and slightly angry, Marjorie walked out of the building in search of the coffee shop. She remembered Hans as a hospitable and polite man and assumed that she would be allowed to enter. She dressed in something she knew he would like and might try to make physical contact as soon as the opportunity presented itself. Exactly 30 minutes later, Hans entered the cafe and was greeted by the waitress. "Hey, Hans, there's a very nervous woman waiting for you. I put her over there," she pointed out, "so you can have a little privacy." Hans smiled and asked, "Has she ordered yet?" "No, she wanted to wait for you." "Thank you. Be kind, bring us my usual, and bring her a cappuccino, please." "Yes, sir," the waitress replied with a wink. Sitting, Hans asked directly, "What do you want, Marjorie?" Marjorie frowned and replied, "I want us to be together again. I was very stupid, but we're not getting any younger, and I know you don't want to be alone as much as I do. Are you out of your mind? I don't want to grow old with you. I'd rather be alone or dead." "You need to get over yourself, Hans. You left without giving me a chance to explain myself, and—" She didn't have time to go any further. "Don't make a villain of me, Marjorie," growled Hans softly. "I gave you everything I had, and you used me like an old blanket. You were the one who betrayed your promises. 3 times, for God's sake. 3 times. There's a promise you made to God, and at least 100 witnesses, and you still let that caress get into your pants and worse. It was a mistake. Of course, a mistake that lasted a long time. You forget that I saw the recordings. They show a degree of intimacy that could only be the result of many years of communication with each other. You grossly ignored my needs while you gave everything to that scumbag. In the end, you even refused to scratch my back. What did I do to deserve such treatment? You are a selfish narcissist who only cares about yourself and how much pleasure you can get from something or someone. And you think that I will put up with you again, even in your wildest dreams. What in God's name were you thinking when you started sleeping with that bastard?" Marjorie was stunned. Her problem was that she hadn't thought at all this time. She just got caught up in the passion of her illicit relationship, and later it just went on because she could. Now she realized how stupid it was to leave her husband for the sake of light youthful fun on the couch. The young woman brought them coffee, looked at Hans. "Is everything okay?" she whispered. Hans just nodded and replied, "Yes, we'll drink our coffee and leave. I'll come by to pay for it tomorrow." Hans drank his double ristretto and spoke. "I think I have made my position on reconciliation clear enough. I understand that we will meet from time to time because we are one family. I will be polite, as I would do with a little-known acquaintance. I hope you will do the same. If not, then it will only get worse for you." He stood up and put on his jacket. "By the way, you were rewarded handsomely for your betrayal. About half of what I always worked hard for. Congratulations on that. Warning: when you see your lover, tell him that if he comes one step closer to me, I will tear him to pieces." With these words, Hans left, leaving Marjorie at a loss. Marjorie and Nick only lasted 6 months before Marjorie kicked him out. Their relationship has become very one-sided. Doreen reprimanded him mercilessly during the divorce, and he was left as poor as a church rat. He lived on Marjorie's money in her house, and, when he needed it, tried to use her as a woman of convenience. This is not what she signed up for. After this collapse, she tried to start over, but she was still lonely and very lonely. Her children and grandchildren were polite and dutifully visited her on her birthday and holidays, helped when she needed help, but that was all. Everyone blamed her for Hans's disappearance, and when they found out that she had cheated on her son-in-law, needed Doreen's intervention because after discovering what she had done, it seemed like her family had disappeared from the face of the earth. It was Doreen who persuaded Marjorie's children not to close the door on their mother, claiming that this would haunt them in the future. Marjorie's life was no longer enjoyable. She felt lonely and unhappy and quite jealous because her ex-husband seemed to be settling in well and had completely cut her out of his life a few minutes ago. Old love flared up again. Late spring next year. This was the last training session before Hans, Kevin, and Rita went to Rainsbergen for the Kennedy March. They had two friends with them, Robert and Sarah. Having learned that Kevin and Rita were going to walk 50 miles at a time, they asked to join them in training, and later asked Hans if he would mind if they joined them in the actual march. By this time, the relationship between Kevin, Rita, and the red-haired twins had become much warmer than just friendship. The five went out onto the terrace of the cafe, where Robert and Sarah's grandmother were waiting for them to take the children home. The woman waved to them. Hans felt a rush of heat wash over him, and the blood rushed to his face. More than 40 years passed, but he recognized her immediately. "Irene Prince," he exclaimed. A woman sitting on a bench asked, "Do I know you?" "They knew a long time ago," said Hans. "It would be more correct to say they knew. That was a long time ago, and I'd like to apologize to you." Irene looked at the man. She estimated that he was several years younger than her. "Who are you, and why do you need to apologize to me?" she asked. "You don't recognize me, which is understandable, so many years have passed," he said. "Hans Peters. It's nice to meet you again." "Hans Peters? Oh my God, it must have been 30 years, Irene said in surprise. "More than 40, to be exact," answered Hans, looking at her carefully. Now he understood where the twins got such red hair. Irene once had the same bright red hair, but now it has turned gray. He looked at her again. She gained a little weight, but still maintained a beautiful figure. Freckles, green eyes, snub nose, and full lips. "It seems time has not touched you. You haven't changed much." Irene laughed. "Liar." She answered, "But what do you want to apologize for?" "About how I treated you then, in the past. I acted like a real ass." "Yes, I still remember," she answered. "It was humiliating when you didn't come that evening." "That's not all. You were in love, but I didn't care. I was insensitive, indifferent. Or rather, selfish. You were absolutely right to stop this. I offended you very much. That's what I want to apologize for. It's all in the past." "Apology accepted," she replied. "Is it true? Thank you. I won't bother you anymore. I don't want to take away from your family time, I guess." She smiled. "No, I came to pick up my grandchildren and their friends. I'm guessing you're with Rita and Kevin." "Oh yes, I'll leave you with 4 Daltons. I need to catch the bus." Irene called out to him when he began to leave, "Sit down and come with us. The car is big enough to take one more passenger." Reluctantly, Hans returned and sat down at the other end of the bench. Irene became curious. The Hans she knew was self-confident and witty. This man seemed almost his opposite. She wanted to know what happened to him, what changed him so much. When he sat down, he took a thermos and a cup from his backpack. "Coffee, black and very strong." "Strong coffee, is that you?" she asked. I know. My mother couldn't make a decent cup of coffee even if it cost her her life. Let's just say I learned a thing or two in the years we didn't see each other, including making coffee." "What else have you learned besides making coffee?" Irene asked playfully. "I hope I'm better than I was before," Hans answered seriously. Irene was somewhat surprised. "Are you still bothered by your behavior 40 years ago?" "With you? Yes, I knew you loved me and I didn't care. Back then I was in 3 relationships at the same time. I apologized to the other 2 a long time ago. They quickly forgot about me. I knew it took you a long time, and by the time I finally realized my mistake, you had already moved. Irene patted Hans on the hand. I forgot everything a long time ago. I have a good life now, and she nodded towards the twins. Let's go, I'll give you a ride. In the car, four young people were discussing the upcoming event. Irene dropped the four off and asked Hans, "It's almost dinner time. Do you want to eat something? I would like to know what happened to you. Sarah and Robert praise you to the skies, but never mention your name. You have always been Kevin and Rita's grandfather. Sounds like you're a great-grandpa." Hans smiled at the compliment. "Thank you. I try, but it's nice to be with them. This makes the task easier. As for dinner, yesterday I made lasagna. I put it in the oven before I left this morning, and the oven is already preheating. Would you like to have dinner with me? I'll even offer you good wine. Your wife won't mind an unexpected guest." "I live alone," answered Hans. It sounded a little drier than he intended. Irene looked at him. "There is a story behind this statement, and it is a sad one." "Yes, that's true. I am divorced, and the woman I divorced was also the reason why I was such an ass to you. But I don't want to talk about it now. I would like to spend a pleasant evening in good company." The dinner was delicious and a pleasant experience for Irene. They mostly talked about small things until the conversation turned back to their grandchildren and what made them walk 50 miles in 20 hours tops. Hans told Irene that he was to blame for this. From early childhood, he took them for walks. First in the park, then in the village, and always talked about his long walks. Irene also loved to walk, but not to such almost extreme distances, and this gave Hans an idea. He suggested, "The Kennedy March we will be walking consists of 4 different circles of approximately 12.5 miles each. There is also a 25-mile route, and one that is half as long. This is the same route as our last lap. Why don't you join us for the last lap? I think your grandchildren will love this." Irene immediately became inspired. "I would really like to. How do I register?" "One moment, please," and Hans went to get his laptop. He opened the site and said, "Right here. Complete this form. I will take care of the registration fee." 5 minutes later, her participation was confirmed. She looked at her watch and was shocked. "It's time for me to go home. It's already 11. My son will be worried." "Your son?" "Long story, and not now either, but I live with my son and his family." "First, text him that you are okay and that you are on your way. Could you call or text me when you arrive safely?" Hans wrote his phone number on a piece of paper, and although she was his guest and took him here, he added his address just in case. At the same time, he said, "I would really like to see you in front of Rainsbergen. Perhaps a training walk in a few days. I'll buy you lunch." Irene smiled widely. "Consider it a date. I had a great time, Hans." Hans walked her to the car. Before Irene got behind the wheel, she hugged him, and kissed him tenderly on the lips. "I'll call you when I'm home so I can check my agenda," she said before starting the car and driving away. Hans walked back with his head in a cloud. The red-haired twins burst into Stefan and Lucy's kitchen. "It worked! It worked! We heard my grandmother telling my father that she met someone she knew from the past. She had dinner with him, they talked all evening, and now she's going on a date with him. And she will come with us, take the 4th round in Rainsburg." Much to Stefan and Lucy's surprise, they all danced happily and kissed each other deeply on the lips. All 4 blushed when they realized they had an audience for whom they wanted to keep their budding romantic relationship a secret for a little longer. "Just friends, right?" Lucy remarked. "But what were you doing?" Kevin stammered. "Well, grandfather is alone and my grandmother is alone too." Sarah completed Kevin's sentence. "So we decided they would get to know each other." Robert moved on. "And we didn't even have to push them together." Rita finished. Stefan chuckled, but Lucy was speechless. This was the first time in a very long period. "What?" Rita asked indignantly. "They are very good people, and we think they will make a beautiful couple." Lucy, who had always been very protective of her father-in-law, wondered out loud when she would be able to meet this woman. This, in turn, caused laughter among the youth. "Mom," Kevin said, laughing, "Grandpa is old enough to be your father. He can take care of himself." Lucy just grumbled to herself, but smiled at the good-natured banter. Everyone knew how she felt about her father-in-law. On the other side of Amsterdam, Irene was beaming with happiness. Early this morning, her phone buzzed with an incoming message from Hans. "Yesterday, I had a wonderful day and an even better evening. May I interest you in a 15-mile walk around Hilversum? This is the trail of footprints, passing through forests, farmland, and heathland. There is enough time for lunch, and if you want, I will add dinner too." She immediately replied, "I would really like to spend the day with you, so I'm very interested. Text me your address, and I'll pick you up at 7. I'll buy train tickets." Irene wrote her address with a warm feeling, despite their long past. She had the feeling that she had met a completely different man. She went downstairs and happily shared this with her son, not realizing that behind one open door, there were two more pairs of ears listening to her. Towards evening, tired but very happy, Irene sat in the first-class compartment of the train home. Hans spoke about his past, and it was revealing. She finally understood why he was so insensitive and self-centered when she was in love with him at the time. It was cleansed from his soul. She patted the seat next to her, motioning for Hans to sit next to her, and when he did, she snuggled into him with a sigh of satisfaction. On a whim, she kissed him on the cheek, saying, "I hope I never get used to this. You know, you spoiled me. I had a wonderful day. I would really like to meet you again, Hans." Blushing at my own insolence, Hans smiled and replied softly, "Try to keep me away." Irene raised her head and noticed that Hans' lips were slowly approaching hers. Her heart began to pound. All kinds of emotions and feelings that had been dormant for so long were awakened again. Their lips met in a tender kiss, full of promises of what the future might hold. The second kiss was different. Irene could not stand it and demanded what she had been deprived of for so long. Irene grew up in an extremely conservative Reformed family. Irene always had problems with indoctrination, and her rebellious attitude led to numerous conflicts with her parents and older sister Edna, who were convinced that she would grow up to be a harlot. It got even worse when she brought Hans to her parents' house. A man with long hair rides a motorcycle and has absolutely no respect for the true faith. Hans once remarked that if there was to be a reckoning, he would take his case to the proper authorities and not to a cabal of religious fanatics who only want to subjugate others. Irene thought that her uncle would have a heart attack when he heard this from Hans. When her uncle unleashed his wrath on the young man, Hans bore it stoically and responded that religion was just another way to enslave people. After that, he was kicked out of the community room, and her uncle and parents began to pressure Irene to break up with this spawn of Satan. This pressure, combined with the attitude shown by Hans, won out and she ended the relationship. Soon after, she was introduced to several eligible young men to marry. This was quite acceptable in the eyes of her uncle and parents. His words were, "Stay here until you repent and return to your faith. I'll leave you alone until you do this. Then I want an answer, and for you to marry one of these men that your parents and I have chosen for you." A day later, she gave in under pressure. Her forced marriage was a loveless marriage. The sex was very one-sided. The man enjoyed it. She herself felt absolutely nothing from the warmth she felt from communicating with Hans. It took some time before she became pregnant. She didn't want children who would have to endure the same loveless upbringing she had. After the birth of Eliyahu, whom everyone called Lai, she was able to talk her husband out of intimacy long enough to contact the Women in Difficulty Foundation. There she told her story and was given a contraceptive implant. Since her husband never touched her except for his marital duties, he didn't notice the implant under the skin on her upper arm. After the third implant, her husband, under the influence of her uncle, became more and more cruel towards Irene and Lai. He also became a religious fanatic, quoting the Bible at every opportunity and further oppressing her and his son. For Irene, this was the last straw. In their first and last marital quarrel, she told him in no uncertain terms that she would stay here with Lai even if she had to get a divorce. She ended up in the hospital, and Lai was placed with friends whom Irene had met at the Foundation for Women in Difficult Situation. When she was discharged from the hospital, divorce proceedings had already begun, and the foundation found her a safe home and a job so she could start a new life. Irene wrote a letter to her parents and uncle that essentially told them to go to hell. They now had only one daughter and no grandchildren, as it seemed her sister was barren. Decades later, Irene sat dozing next to the man who was tugging at her heart again, just as he had done so many years ago, and she felt happy and safe. Hans felt Irene leaning against him more and more and hugged her. She muttered with satisfaction, "It's so nice, I love you," and fell asleep. Hans heard her mutter and was a little surprised at how quickly Irene's feelings for him were developing. He decided to seriously analyze his own feelings. He didn't want to be an ass again and hurt her a second time. Some time later, their arrival at the station was announced. Hans came to a conclusion and was at peace with himself. He kissed Irene and whispered, "It's time for my beautiful fairy to wake up. We're almost there." Irene awoke from her refreshing slumber and looked around. Her eyes widened as she realized what Hans said after he kissed her. "Is it true? Do you want me to be yours? If you meant what you said before you fell asleep, and of course, if you want it." Irene remembered her words, "How nice it is, I love you." Her cheeks turned red, she looked at her hands, quickly thought about everything and answered, "Yes and yes, with all my heart." Hans said, "It's funny. It's all happening so quickly, and I don't mind one bit. The only other woman with whom I felt as comfortable and loved was my sister-in-law, and it was purely platonic, except for one time, which I told you about. I always felt like I was competing with my ex-wife, and I think deep down I always had to be on my guard." "Hans, what are your intentions regarding my mother?" Lai asked him at the first family meeting, which was attended by both families, Irene and Hans. The march in Rainsburg was a great success, and from then on Hans and Irene spent a lot of time together. They both understood where they were coming from, and day by day their connection grew deeper. Both were on a new path for them. A mature and deep love developed between them. Irene told Hans about her marriage because she wasn't confident in her capacity for physical love, except when they kissed on the sofa. There was some touching, but it never went beyond clothing. Hans introduced Irene to his family, and at the end of the day, Louise and Lucy surrounded him as he washed dishes in the kitchen. "Dad, don't let her go," Louise persuaded him. "Yes, you'll be good for each other. She loves you. She's even in love with you. Don't ruin it," Lucy added. "Hey, that was my line," Louise said, nudging her sister-in-law. They both laughed happily, not only because Hans was happy, but also because after Louise and Brian's reconciliation, they became best friends. Louise knew that Lucy had played a decisive role in getting Hans to talk to Brian. "Ladies, I intend to make her happy as long as she allows me. Is that enough for you?" Both women laughed with joy. "Lai, I'll give you the same answer I gave my daughters." Aaliyah looked at him. "Daughters? I thought you only had one daughter." Hans smiled. "You forgot about my sister-in-law, Lucy." "Ah, I see," Lai replied, falling silent. After a few seconds, Hans continued. "Oh, my answer. It's simple. I intend to give her happiness as long as she will allow me. Is this promise enough to make my intentions clear?" Lai took Hans by the hands and replied, "Yes, Hans. I have talked to your children, and I am sure that you will be good for her. She deserves it. One last question, please. Are you going to marry her? If it makes your mother happy, then yes, without hesitation. However, a promise is enough for me. Wedding vows are broken as easily as promises. I have experienced it. If we decide that we will be together and promise each other to be the only one with whom we want to spend our lives, that will be enough for me." Lai winced at the pressure with which the answer was delivered and replied, "I just asked. It doesn't matter to me whether you get married or not. I care about my mother's happiness. That's all. Aaliyah Henkel, I solemnly promise you that I will do everything possible to make your mother happy. She needs and deserves it. If you notice that I am not up to the task, I expect you to come and remind me of my duties. Lai was impressed by the conviction with which Hans spoke, and after a while he replied, "Can I call you Dad? I never had a real father worthy of this title, but I think you will." Hans hugged him, saying, "Of course, I always wanted another son." Sometime later in the evening, the conversation turned to where to go on vacation, and that Irene always went with Lai and his wife Josephine because she was still afraid that her ex-husband would somehow show up. Lai looked at his mother and noticed her worry, even though she tried to hide it. Hans noticed this interaction and said, "You can stay with me if you don't want to be alone." Irene felt great relief. She walked up to Hans and kissed him on the lips. It was the first real kiss she gave Hans in public. Then she said, "I'd really like that." Holding hands, they realized that they were surrounded by both families cheering and whistling. Irene walked through the door, rolling her suitcase behind her. She turned and kissed Hans. When their lips parted, she said quietly, "Thank you for having me." "I will do everything to keep you happy and safe," Hans replied. Irene took her suitcase and rolled it into the master bedroom, turned and, blushing to the roots of her hair, said, "I want to sleep in your bed. I think it's time to take a step forward. You were a true gentleman, but I need to get over my upbringing. It was the first time I experienced something like sexual pleasure with you, and I forced myself to stop as soon as it began to overwhelm me. My ex-husband never cared about me." Hans hugged her and whispered, "We will move slowly, step by step, and come back if you feel uncomfortable. I'll make room for your things." Delighted by Hans's understanding and acceptance, Irene began to unpack her suitcase. That evening, they snuggled close to each other in bed, and Hans gently stroked Irene's breasts through her thin nightgown. Irene lay motionless next to Hans as he quietly asked, "Can I touch your breasts under your nightgown?" Without saying a word, Irene sat up and resolutely took it off over her head. Awkwardly, she said, "I'm not 20 anymore." When Hans looked at her, "You're even more beautiful than I remember," Hans replied, looking at her body. Hans pulled her towards him again and continued to caress her breasts, while his other hand slid to her navel and the edge of her panties. Her breathing became rapid. "No more, please," she suddenly whispered. "I'm losing myself too much." Hans stopped and hugged Irene to him. This happened in their youth too. Every time she got aroused to a certain level, she stopped. Hans internally cursed those who were responsible for her upbringing. It was obvious to him that she really liked physical contact, but she was afraid to cross the line beyond which she could lose herself in the bliss of orgasm. This went on for several nights, and each time Hans moved a little further until Irene found herself completely naked in his bed. He enjoyed the view. She looked for ways she could reciprocate his feelings and found an educational website about sex. She was amazed and continued searching further. She soon ended up on a site where she saw women doing all sorts of things to men. Hans and Irene had a wonderful dinner. Irene, as an exception, drank 2 glasses of wine with her meal, and after dessert Hans offered her a glass of 20-year-old Oloroso sherry. After that they cuddled on the sofa. Irene felt very relaxed and receptive to Hans' wonderful caresses. Something new was awakening inside her. Lazily, she said, "I'm going to take a quick shower and then get under the covers. Should I join you and wash your back?" "I was hoping you would ask about this." "Yes, please," she replied, and together they went upstairs. In the shower, they washed each other, kissing and caressing each other's bodies. After they dried each other, he laid her on the bed and had sex with her. Irene clung to Hans as if her life depended on it. And she fell asleep. For the first time since they got back together, they were in bed together, naked, and his lover had fallen asleep after sex. He weakened, laughed quietly, and thought, "This is how a woman feels when her lover satisfies his need and thinks only of himself." With a feeling of accomplishment and having at least established something right, Hans went to the bathroom, washed his face, and brushed his teeth. When he finished, he hugged Irene and soon after fell asleep himself. They spent the rest of the day in the house, naked under their robes so they could explore and enjoy each other's touches. "Woman, you look like you ran a marathon and you're glowing. What happened?" Doreen asked the next morning when she came to visit. Hans was busy in the kitchen, and Irene blushed furiously. She nodded towards the kitchen and whispered, "Hans happened. I have never had such an experience in my life. He's beautiful, isn't he? The best lover I've ever had. That includes Fred." Irene looked at Doreen in disbelief, who hastened to explain, "It was one night. Sex for revenge, and I made sure he didn't stand a chance that night. We have since returned to our platonic brother-sister relationship." Suddenly Doreen's face became very serious. "And don't you dare hurt him." Stunned, Irene almost screamed, "There is no way I could hurt him. I've been his completely since last night, and I desperately want to keep it that way. I've never felt anything like this for a man." Doreen smiled. "Calm down, girl. I was just testing the waters. I have an idea, but we need to talk to Hans too." Hans entered the room just in time to hear the last words. He asked, "Why do you need me?" "Coffee," Doreen and Irene shouted at the same time. "And I smell fresh apple pie. You've been busy, Hans." The hidden meaning in Doreen's words completely escaped Hans, but Irene blushed from ear to ear, and this did not escape Doreen. She winked at the woman who was supposed to make Hans happy again. As the four of them sat at the table, Doreen began, "Fred and I decided to spend the rest of our lives together, so he moved in with me. We feel like it should be celebrated, but I want to do a double celebration." Doreen looked at Irene. "When are you moving in with Hans?" Irene didn't know what to do until Hans intervened. "Doreen, you're not pushing, you're ramming. Stop it." He took Irene's hand and stroked it gently. This gesture in itself already made Irene feel loved and calmer until Hans asked, "Would you like this? Live here and share the rest of your life with me in this house? I know we have already promised to be together exclusively." Irene pulled him towards her and kissed him deeply. When she released him, Hans said dryly, "I think I got my answer. What do you want? Do you want or need a symbol of our affection, or is my word enough?" "What word?" Irene asked to calm her doubts. "That I love you and that I really want to grow old with you. I know we're taking a risk because we've only really known each other for a short time, but I'm pretty sure we can do it. Do you want to buy me a ring?" "Yes, if that's what you need or want. I would like a simple white gold ring or something like that. Not for confirmation, but to show everyone. I've never had jewelry. It was considered an adornment for the devil," they said. "I was the devil in those days. Now this will be a symbol of my love for you." Doreen's smile on her face, and she said, "I've never seen such an unromantic proposal and so sincere at the same time. You two really make each other so happy that I almost want to cry with happiness." She kissed them both, Hans on the lips, and wanted to kiss Irene on the cheek, but she turned her head to look at Hans, and Doreen's lips pressed against hers. Irene held her kiss for a moment and then smiled as they pulled away. "This is the first time. I've never kissed a woman. But keep in mind that this is all you will get from me and Hans, and nothing more. You warned me not to hurt Hans, and now I warn you that he is mine and mine alone." Doreen was amazed at the power that Irene now radiated and replied seriously, "The message is understood. We will both make our men happy and hold each other accountable if we don't try hard enough." "It's agreed, sister-in-law," Irene said and hugged Doreen tightly. Gasping, Doreen thought, "Damn, this woman doesn't know her strength." She continued, "I want to send a message to our families and, most of all, to our exes. I want to have a barbecue and invite everyone, including our exes, just to show that we got back on our feet despite everything they threw at us." Irene was horrified. You're not going to include my family, are you? I'm not sure I like this idea. But Doreen was determined and confident of her success. A few weeks later, the garden of a large house in Holland Reading was ready to receive its first guests. Hans and Irene's children arrived first, along with their children. Their cars were loaded with food because as soon as Doreen sent out the invitations, they wanted to take part in the celebration. Like arrived next with his family, and after that the rest gradually began to gather. Marjorie entered through the gate with great anxiety, remembering the past. She finally accepted the fact that Hans had every right to divorce her and brutally slammed the door on her attempt to reconcile. The remark that she had been richly rewarded for her betrayal still stung, but he was right about that too. She got a very good divorce settlement and was able to live quite comfortably. The only, but important, disadvantage was that she was still alone. She also still wondered how Hans knew. This morning was the first time since Hans had left her life as her husband that she had come to a family barbecue. Usually she refused the invitation, but Doreen's invitation was worded in such a way that this time she could not. Marjorie walked into the garden and looked out the kitchen window to see Hans passionately kissing a woman with graying and red hair. The realization hit her like an anvil. She remembered that day perfectly, which now suddenly became untrue to her. She was sure that Hans would be gone for at least another 30 minutes and Doreen was upstairs taking a shower, so she and Nick indulged in a long, passionate kiss. Later that day, they commented to each other that they almost got caught. A few minutes after the kiss, they found Hans sitting in the garden, untying his walking boots. "You're early. We didn't expect you for another half hour. Did you come by bus?" She joked, thinking, that was too close to failure. I need to warn Nick. But when Hans showed no signs of noticing anything suspicious, she abandoned all thoughts of it, and it cost her her marriage. Irene's sister, Edna, arrived next. Despite the weather, she was dressed from head to toe in conservative clothing and was determined to bring her sister back into the fold of her community now that her ex-husband had died in the line of duty to God. He left all the money earned by this debt to Irene and Legia instead of the community that so needed this money. Accompanying her was one of the community's lawyers, the man who was to execute the will. Otherwise, of course, she would never have accepted the invitation. Edna looked around and found only people enjoying life, with Irene in the foreground. She decided to try and ruin her day. She did not like her sister at all with her freedom-loving ideas and depraved morals. She approached her and without any preamble said, "Do you know that your husband Judas is dead? He died defending our faith while you celebrate your corruption." Irene looked at her sister, paused for a minute, and replied, "We divorced a long time ago because your faith gave him permission to use me as his slave and beat our son for no reason. So why are you telling me this?" The ensuing conversation was brutal, and Irene ended it by saying, "My ex-husband made his fortune by killing people in the name of his version of Christianity. In fact, he is nothing more than a mercenary, an assassin. Do you want me to come to the meeting house to settle inheritance issues? I absolutely won't go there. I know exactly what you're up to. Your uncle already did this to me once. I'll discuss this with Elijah and you'll hear from our lawyer. Rest assured that we will accept this inheritance." As Irene spoke her last words, she glanced suggestively at Like, who had joined the two sisters as he noticed their conversation becoming increasingly tense. Edna, not used to being contradicted, began to get angry. She hissed, "This money belongs to our community to be used to spread the faith." "Let me disagree. This money belongs to Legia and me, as stated in Judah Henkel's will, and will be used at our discretion, not in the hands of a bunch of bigots who take scripture out of context to justify their behavior." Edna turned red with anger and raised her hand to hit her sister. Like intervened and grabbed her hand tightly, saying, "This conversation is over. You will hear from our lawyer now. Get out." The last word came out almost like a growl. Edna and her lawyer rushed out of the garden, like hugging his mother. "I'm proud of you, Mom. You did great, but I don't want that bloody money." "I don't want it either, but think of all the good we can do with them. For example, for the organization Doctors Without Borders. Life's face lit up. "What an idea," he exclaimed. Meanwhile, other guests arrived. Marjorie talked to Louise and Stefan and was pleased that since they saw Hans happy again, their attitude towards her also became much more friendly. Nick showed up too. Marjorie was amazed at how he had let himself go. He had always been a little overweight, but now he was clearly leaning towards obesity. His face was blotchy and veiny with rosacea. Nick sat down heavily, and when one of his grandchildren asked what he would like to drink, his answer did not surprise his children. "A glass of white wine if you can, honey." After lunch, Hans and Fred started to fire up the barbecue. In the hours between his arrival and the two friends starting to fire up the barbecue, Nick drank a bottle of white wine and was already on his way to Red. His gaze suddenly fell on Irene. Sarah was just carrying empty glasses into the house and walked past Nick. He asked her, "Who is this woman talking to Doreen?" Sarah, not knowing who was asking, replied, "This is my grandmother." "Is she Doreen's friend? How did they meet?" "They are more like sisters-in-law. My grandmother is Hans's friend. They have been living together for some time." Nick was overcome with jealousy. This cuckold ruined his comfortable lifestyle and left with an even more beautiful woman than Marjorie. Irene had just left Doreen to help her granddaughter when Nick said loudly, "So you are Hans's new mistress. Be careful, girl. He couldn't satisfy his ex, and I had to help with that. So if you want to cuckold him when he can't do it again, just call me, okay?" That's where he ended. Irene's slap on Nick's cheek echoed throughout the garden. Irene raised her other hand for another slap, but Marjorie was faster. Another slap was heard throughout the entire area. Irene and Marjorie's handprints were left on both sides of Nick's face. Hans's eyes sparkled with rage as he began to approach Nick, but he was held back by Fred, who furiously whispered, Don't go near him. You won't help Irene if you end up in jail for assault. Leave it to them." Fred was able to hold hands down long enough for them to witness Doreen approach Nick. Nick was just beginning to recover from the heavy blows to the face when Doreen kneed him in the groin. Doreen was interrupted by her own children. "Leave it to us, Mom. It's time to take out the trash. This time it's final. We are so ashamed of him." Later that day, Marjorie found herself in the company of Irene. They were alone, cleaning the kitchen, when she finally dared to say, "Irene, please take care of my ex-husband. He didn't deserve to be treated the way I treated him." Irene looked in surprise at the woman nervously fiddling with her hands. "You still love him." It was a statement of fact, not a question, and Marjorie, still fiddling with her hands and looking anywhere but at Irene, replied, "Yes, I realized that too late. I know I've burned all my bridges, but I want to see Hans happy, and I see that you make him happy. Making him happy should be my job, and it is with great regret that I must hand it over to you." Irene saw in front of her an upset woman revealing her soul. She took a step forward and hugged her. "Thank you. It must have cost you a lot. Say it and admit that it's your fault. I must admit that I met a completely different person than the one with whom I broke off relations so long ago. Either way, I know how you feel. This is no different from my feelings towards Hans. He's an amazing person. Did you know him before? Long story. I'll tell you later, over a bottle of wine, maybe. I would like that. Now let's finish the kitchen." That night in bed, Irene told Hans about her meeting with Marjorie and her promise to have a heart-to-heart talk with her over a glass of wine. "She's really remorseful, you know, and she's torturing herself. I had already forgiven her once and warned her that she had exhausted her credit, and Marjorie admitted this in a letter. She had a long-term affair with Nick that lasted for years. If it weren't for Fred, I would have killed that man today for his remarks and betrayal. I thought he was my friend. I don't care if you become friends with Marjorie, but keep her away from me as much as possible. I definitely don't want to be her friend. Her betrayal was too much for this." Irene thought for a moment and replied, "I understand. Last question. Which? My ex-husband's inheritance. What are we going to do with him? Whatever you want. I definitely don't want anything to do with this. I have enough money for both of us. If you don't feel comfortable accepting this money, just donate it to some NGO that can do something good. Irene kissed him passionately and whispered, I thought you would say something like that. You are a good person, Hans Peters. Let me reward you for this. Hans woke up to the constant ringing of his landline phone. He looked at his watch and muttered sleepily, It's 6:30 in the morning. I hope it's something important. He picked up the phone and said rudely, Peters is on the phone. Doreen replied, The police were just at my house. Nick is dead. Suddenly Hans woke up completely. What? How? He crashed his car into a concrete column of the viaduct. The police saw it happen. But Donald got him home, right? The man from the liquor store called the police later that day. He refused to sell Nick a bottle of juniper because he was drunk as a cobbler. Nick returned to his car and had just pulled out of the parking lot when the police showed up. When they tried to stop him, he started running. During the chase, Nick crashed into a column. The officer said he died instantly. Do you want me to come? No, I called the children first. They don't understand why I was still his emergency contact. He never seems to change that. They will take care of me. And about Nick's funeral. They have already promised this, and I still have a few calls to make. Hans was silent for a minute. How are you feeling? I don't know yet. I'm stunned. I didn't love him anymore, but he was a big part of my life, even though he's been acting like a complete jerk lately. Okay, we'll come later in the morning. I don't think you should be alone right now, if that's okay with you. I would like that. See you later. With these words, Doreen passed out. Only the way Nick met his end was a surprise. His lifestyle led to a rapid deterioration of his health, and despite the pleas of his children, he stubbornly continued his self-destruction. The funeral was a sad event. Doreen and Fred, her children and grandchildren, Irene and Hans, to support them. Louise and Stefan also came with their children. There were no friends or relatives on his side. He has managed to alienate everyone since his divorce. Edna tried to challenge Judith's will, but was unsuccessful. The court showed no interest in the arguments made by Edna on behalf of the community. Irene and Elijah became briefly rich. Lige used some of the money to pay for the twins' education, and, much to the indignation of Edna and the community, donated the rest to Doctors Without Borders and War Child. Edna sent them a letter full of fire and brimstone in which she claimed that this money was intended to spread Christianity among the pagans. This was God's plan for this money. Like wanted to write a searing response, but after a long conversation with Hans, he abandoned the idea. The argument that his aunt would be blind to any opinion that did not conform to her ideas of how the world should be finally convinced him that it was not worth the effort. Life went on. The connection and love between Hans and Irene deepened, as did that between Doreen and Fred, and both couples found each other. They often went to concerts, the theater, or went on hikes. Irene had long conversations with Marjorie and gradually included her in the lives of others. Hans, keeping his promise, was polite to her, but very formal on those occasions when Irene invited his ex-wife to dinner or casual outings. Of course, they also met at formal events such as weddings and holidays. Much to Marjorie's disappointment, he never kissed, hugged, or even touched her. This went on for some time until one afternoon Marjorie confessed to Irene that she had met a man and they had fallen in love. She was in love. Over the course of several months, 4 people saw a very happy Marjorie. Hans had his doubts. He found the man too smooth and evasive when someone asked him personal questions. One day, there was a loud knock on their door, and when they opened it, Marjorie jumped straight into Hans's arms, wailing, "I'm so sorry, so deeply sorry." "For what?" Hans asked, clearly stunned. "Because I cheated on you. It must have been such humiliation and pain for you." "Yeah, I can't argue with that, but why are you so worried about it all of a sudden?" Marjorie burst into bitter tears, and Irene gently led her into the living room. She began stuttering, "Last week I gave Hank the key to the house, and a few days ago I came home early to cook a nice dinner for two. And I found him in my bed with some bitch. Before I kicked him out, he told me that if I had let him stay, this wouldn't have happened." She looked at Hans. "I've been feeling sorry for myself and angry all week. It wasn't until this morning that I realized how you must have felt. After all, we were married for many years, and I made a promise to you." She took a deep, shaky breath. "Dear Hans, it took me this painful realization before I matured, came to my senses, and realized how my behavior affected you. I also understand that this is too little, too late, but I deeply regret that I was stupid, immature, and callous towards you. I apologize from the bottom of my soul for hurting you and humiliating you in this way." She turned to Irene. "I'm pretty sure this won't be necessary, but I'm doing it anyway. Promise me that you will take good care of him and won't fall into the same trap I did. If I even suspect that you are not treating him the way he deserves, you and I will talk. Now, if you will allow me, I must talk to my sister. I destroyed her marriage, too." Marjorie wanted to get up and leave, but a strong hand on her shoulder prevented her from doing so. Shocked, she sat down again. This was the first time in many years that Hans touched her. He always kept his distance and made even a simple handshake impossible. Gently, he said, "I have been waiting a long time for you to show remorse. It just hurts that you had to go through what I went through to get this. I wish this wasn't necessary. I also accept your apology because I feel it is sincere. Now get up so I can give you a real hug." Slowly, with disbelief in her eyes, Marjorie stood up. As she straightened up, she looked at Irene, who nodded at her in encouragement. With open arms, Hans walked around the sofa, and when he stood in front of her, she melted into his arms. There she broke down. A trembling ran through her body, and she began to sob. This turned into real agony, and she cried like a river, pouring her tears heavily onto Hans' t-shirt. Gradually, the pain, anger, and loneliness left her in these moments, and soon she realized that there were too many hands around her. Irene was also holding her from behind, and she didn't even notice how Irene joined her and Hans. It was Irene who helped her sit back down on the sofa, and when Marjorie had settled down, Hans said to her, "You are not fit to drive now. It can wait." "No, I need to do this now before I lose my courage." Irene said, "I have a solution." With that, she picked up the phone, and a few seconds later, "Doreen, I need you to come here. Bring Fred with you." She listened for a few seconds and responded, "Yes, it's important. Trust me on this. And yes, it's urgent. And no, it's not life-threatening. See you in an hour." She turned to Marjorie. "Did you hear? They're on their way. Let's get you cleaned up." When Doreen arrived, Marjorie had to eat her bitter truth again, although this time she was a little less emotional, having poured out most of her remorse for the first time. All five of them decided to relax after such an emotional morning. The sisters made up after a tense conversation in the privacy of Hans' hobby room. They eventually walked out holding hands and giggling. When they returned to Hans and Irene, Marjorie looked exhausted. The last week, and especially today, had completely worn her out. Doreen noticed this and told her, "You will come with us. I won't let you be alone in this apartment, and I don't think you can drive." With these words, she took the emotionally depressed Marjorie by the hands and led her to the car, where Fred was already waiting behind the wheel. When Hans and Irene were alone, Irene sat down next to Hans and put her legs on his. She kissed him and said, "You forgave Marjorie pretty quickly, didn't you?" "No, I came to terms with it after our training walk to Rainsbergen. I realized that if I wanted to be happy again and be in a loving relationship, I needed to let go of my resentments. So I asked for help, and it turned out to be quite helpful. I wanted to see Marjorie realize that she was responsible for the end of our marriage and how painful it was for me. It seems that sometimes empathy can only be learned through personal experience. In her case, through gaining experience at the cost of what she has experienced. And now, now we will live happily ever after. That's not what I meant, you idiot. What I mean is, will you continue your liquid nitrogen treatment? No, she was once the love of my life, and she is the mother of my children. Maybe we can be friends if that's what she wants. That's what I wanted to hear. Now you need to take me to the bedroom so I can reward you properly. 2 decades later, Louise looked out the door and noticed her father looking out the window at the trees. "How are you, Dad?" she asked softly. "I'm holding on, my dear. I'm just holding on. Since Irene left, my enjoyment of life has wavered like a candle about to go out." Louise looked at him with concern. Irene left after a short illness. She complained of back pain, and at first everyone thought it was osteoporosis or a hernia. But the examination showed something much worse. Cancer. It started in the kidneys, but by the time it was discovered, it was too late. It spread everywhere to the bones, lungs, liver. Louise interrupted his thoughts. "Dad, have you thought about your birthday? The family wanted to know if you wanted to celebrate." Hans thought for a moment and replied, "I would like to. Only for the family and Doreen and Marjorie. Restaurant General, I'll call them. They have a place for family dining. I don't want dinner. And then we can take a walk in the forest." Everyone thought that Hans's birthday was a huge success. Hans was in his usual good mood, joking and having fun. Since Hans's birthday fell on a Sunday, they decided to celebrate it on that day. It was a typical Dutch autumn day. Sun, rain, gusts of wind, but overall quite pleasant weather. The great-grandchildren kicked the leaves, which already covered the ground in large quantities in all the autumn colors. At the end of the day, Hans asked to be taken back to his apartment. He's tired. Louise wanted to go straight away, but Hans insisted on saying goodbye to everyone who was present. He did this with a kind word, a hug, and a kiss for each of them. Returning to his apartment, he hugged Louise, kissed her forehead, and said, "Thank you for everything. Don't forget that I love you all." "We love you too, Dad. You are a wonderful father to all of us." Louise returned to the restaurant. She felt a little bad about how her father ended the day. It was as if he was closing a chapter of his life. She decided to talk to Stefan about it before they went home. "You noticed it too, and you're right. I had the same feeling. You know what? I'll go see him tomorrow morning for breakfast. I'll see how he feels," Stefan replied. "Sister?" Louise heard her brother's reserved voice. "What's happened?" she asked. "This morning his neighbor wanted to bring him coffee and breakfast in honor of his birthday. She had a key, just like her father had a key to her apartment." Stefan took a deep breath. She found him dead, in bed with a smile on his face. He didn't celebrate his birthday yesterday. He was saying goodbye. His neighbor knew he had heart problems, an aneurysm or something, or a weak spot in his heart. There's something wrong with his valve in the ventricle. Louise controlled her emotions and said, "Can we agree that our father died happily of a broken heart? Yes, now he is back together with Irene." And subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.